What's good, everyone? This is Vision Harry, and boy do we have a treat for you. Arabella Figg handed the DMLE 30 years of notes on Harry. Dumbledore's name was on every page. Hit subscribe and the bell. Let the story begin. Chapter 1, The Woman with the Journals. The trolley had a squeaky wheel. That was the first thing anyone in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement noticed, that distinctive, rhythmic squeak 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 coming down the corridor on a Tuesday morning in late October, before most of the department had finished their first cup of tea. People looked up from their desks. A few poked their heads out of office doors. Someone from the improper use of magic division muttered something about maintenance. Then they saw what was on the trolley, and they stopped thinking about the wheel. Journals. Dozens of them, stacked in careful towers held in place with thick leather straps, each one numbered in a small, precise hand on the spine. Some were fat and swollen with inserted pages. Some had tabs, color-coded tabs, the kind you got at Muggle stationery shops, bristling from their edges like the fins of strange fish. A few had photographs tucked into their covers, Muggle photographs that didn't move, showing a street, a house, a garden, a child. The woman pushing the trolley was small and gray-haired, wearing a cardigan the color of old moss, and she walked with the kind of unhurried certainty that made people step out of her way without quite knowing why. She had a canvas bag over one shoulder. Her shoes were sensible. She looked, at first glance, like someone's aunt who had taken a wrong turn on the way to the post office. She stopped at the reception desk and waited for the young wizard behind it to finish being startled. "I'd like to speak to whoever is currently heading the Active Investigations Division," she said. Her voice was pleasant and completely unmovable. "If they're busy, I'm happy to wait. I've been waiting for quite some time already, so a few more minutes won't trouble me." The young wizard blinked at the trolley. "And, your name, ma'am?" "Arabella Figg." She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag. "I live at number 7, Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging, Surrey. I am a Squib, a former Order of the Phoenix associate, and for 30 years I kept detailed observational records of the childhood of one Harry James Potter." She paused, and something moved behind her eyes, not quite satisfaction, not quite grief. Something that had been waiting a very long time to become something else. "I believe the department will find them relevant." Hermione Granger had been deputy head of the DMLE for 2 years, and in that time she had handled enchanted artifacts that ate memories, a trafficking ring that operated through portkeys disguised as tourist souvenirs, and 3 separate attempts by former Death Eaters to have their convictions posthumously overturned on technicalities. She had not, until this Tuesday morning, handled anything quite like Arabella Figg. "Walk me through it," she said, sitting across the table in interview room 4, which was the largest one they had and still felt crowded with the trolley in the corner. She had a notepad open in front of her. She hadn't written anything on it yet. From the beginning. Mrs. Figg folded her hands on the table. She had accepted a cup of tea, builder's strength, no sugar, and she hadn't touched it. "I was placed on Privet Drive in 1982, she said. "I don't use the word placed lightly. Dumbledore arranged my tenancy. He suggested the property to me, ensured the rental price was manageable, and made clear, though not in writing, he was never foolish enough to do it in writing, that my purpose there was to observe the boy. Observe him. Watch him. Ensure he survived." She said it very flatly. Not angrily. Just factually, the way you describe a job that had long since lost any veneer of romance it might once have had. He was 1 year old when he arrived at the Dursleys. I began making notes in 1983, when he was 3, when I first noticed the bruising on his arms didn't match the kind 3-year-olds typically get from falling over. Hermione didn't flinch, but something behind her face went very still. "I want to be clear about something before we go any further," Mrs. Figg said. She looked directly at Hermione with eyes that were sharp and gray and had clearly spent decades seeing things they were not supposed to see. "I am not here for revenge. I'm not here because I have an axe to grind with a dead man, though I understand that will be how some people choose to frame this. I am here because those records exist, because they tell a true and documented story, and because the people and institutions named in them have never been held to any account whatsoever. That seems to me like an omission that wants correcting. Mrs. Figg. Hermione put her quill down. I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to understand I'm asking it because it matters, not because I'm trying to dismiss you. Why now? Harry's been an adult for nearly a decade. The war ended 9 years ago. Dumbledore has been dead for 11 years. Mrs. Figg picked up her tea, finally, and took a sip. 11 years, yes. And for 11 years, I watched. I watched Harry Potter be celebrated and mourned and mythologized and scrutinized and written about in 14 different books, at least 2 of which I found deeply objectionable in their cheerful gloss over certain relevant facts. I watched the Wisengamot reconstitute itself. I watched the ministry reorganize. I watched Hermione Granger become deputy head of the DMLE. Something that might have been a smile crossed her face, brief and genuine. I was waiting for someone I trusted to be in the right position. It took a while. Hermione sat with that for a moment. Also, Mrs. Figg added, I turned 78 last month, and I would rather have this conversation while I'm still alive to have it. It took 4 hours to do the initial catalogue. Hermione called in 2 of her best investigators, Proudfoot, who was grey-templed and methodical and had a gift for cross-referencing, and a younger woman named Cho Chang who had transferred to DMLE from magical creatures 3 years ago and had a habit of asking the questions nobody else thought to ask. They sat around a large table with the journals spread out in order, and Mrs. Figg walked them through the filing system. It was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. 32 journals, running from 1983 to 2001, the year Harry turned 21. Observations logged by date, by location, by weather conditions, by who was present. A separate index volume that cross-referenced incidents by category, physical injuries, food restriction, social isolation, educational interference, magical incidents, accidental, magical incidents, responsive to emotional state, anomalous visitors to Privet Drive. A third section of each journal dedicated entirely to correspondence, muggle and magical, that Mrs. Figg had managed to observe, photograph, or in several cases steam open and reseal. You steamed open their mail? Cho said, not disapprovingly, just making sure she'd understood. Some of it, Mrs. Figg said. The letters from Dumbledore, specifically. He wrote to the Dursleys 6 times over 30 years. I have transcriptions of 4 of those letters and photographs of 2 of them. He also received 3 letters from them, which I didn't manage to intercept, but I did observe Petunia Dursley writing one of them, and I noted its length and her demeanor. Proudfoot was already building a timeline on the wall, sticking dates to the board with a charm that would have been excessive for most filing jobs. It looked like the beginning of something very large and very complicated, and Hermione was looking at it with an expression that might have been professional assessment except that her jaw was slightly too tight for that. The photographs, Cho said, spreading a small stack of muggle prints across the table carefully. These are all of Harry. Not all. Some are of the property. I wanted a record of the physical environment. Mrs. Figg sorted through a few and set one aside. This one is from August 1987. He's 7 here. You can see, I see it, Hermione said quietly. The photograph showed a small boy in what appeared to be a garden, wearing clothes approximately 2 sizes too large, crouched down to look at something in the grass. He was thin. Even in a muggle photograph, even without the benefit of motion, you could see the sharpness of his shoulder blades through the oversized t-shirt. I sent 2 letters to the ministry in the first 3 years, Mrs. Figg said. 1984 and 85. I sent them to the office of the chief warlock because I didn't know who else to send them to, and in 85 I didn't even know if Dumbledore was still chief warlock, but I sent it anyway. Neither was acknowledged. She paused. I sent a 3rd letter in 1991, when I learned Harry had received his Hogwarts letter and would be leaving for school. I addressed it to Dumbledore directly and I said very plainly that I had been observing conditions on Privet Drive for 8 years and that what I had observed constituted a pattern of deliberate negligence that I believed he needed to address. He wrote back 4 days later. Cho looked up. You have that letter? I have my letter and his reply, both. Mrs. Figg reached into the canvas bag and produced a clear protective sleeve containing 2 pieces of parchment. She set it on the table between them with the careful deliberateness of someone placing the final piece in a puzzle they've been working on for a very long time. Hermione reached for it. She read it. She read it again. Then she stood up, excused herself with the kind of composure that costs something to maintain, walked to the far end of the room, and stood with her back to everyone for about 20 seconds. When she turned around, her face was professionally neutral again. I need to make a fluke call, she said. And I need everyone in this room to understand that what we're doing here is following the evidence where it leads, which means we are not drawing conclusions, we are not briefing the press, and we are not, under any circumstances, discussing this outside this room until I know what we're dealing with. Are we clear? Proudfoot nodded, already charming everything on the board to be visible only to authorized personnel. Cho was still looking at the photograph of the 7-year-old in the garden. Yes, ma'am, she said, without looking up. Mrs. Figg took another sip of her long cold tea and waited, because she had become very good at waiting, and because she already knew, down to the bone, exactly what Hermione Granger was about to do. The fluke call took 11 minutes. Harry arrived in 17. He came through the main entrance rather than the flue. He'd apparat to the visitor entrance and walked up, which meant he'd had just enough time in transit to think but not enough to settle. Hermione could always tell the difference. When Harry had had time to settle, he was deliberate. Quiet. He'd walk into a room and immediately take stock of it. When he hadn't had time to settle, he walked like he was already in the middle of a conversation. He walked into interview room 4 like he was already in the middle of a conversation. He was taller than he'd been at 17, obviously, broader through the shoulders in the way men got in their mid to late 20s, and he still wore his hair like he'd given up on it years ago and had simply reached an understanding with it. His robes were dark green, Auror dress, the kind he wore when he wasn't in the field. He had a slight scar along his left jaw from a case 2 years ago that had involved a cursed sword and a very fast staircase, and his eyes behind his glasses were the same impossible green they'd always been, currently aimed directly at Mrs. Figg with an expression that was 3 things at once: recognition, wariness, and something that hadn't decided what it was yet. Arabella, he said. Harry. She stood up, and there was something in the way she looked at him, something she had clearly been practicing, keeping in reserve for exactly this moment, that was private and complicated and full of 30 years. You look well. I was told you walked in this morning with. He looked at the trolley. He looked at the journals. He looked at the board on the wall that Proudfoot had covered but not removed. He looked back at Mrs. Figg. How long have you been keeping these? Since you were 3 years old. The room was very quiet. I should have come to you first, she said, and her voice had lost a little of its composure for the first time all morning. Not much. But enough. I debated that for a long time. I know you've worked very hard to. She stopped. Tried again. I thought if I came to you first, you would ask me not to do this. And I decided I couldn't let that stop me. Harry looked at her for a long moment, and whatever was happening behind his face was something that Hermione and Proudfoot and Cho all had the good sense not to try to read. Have you eaten? He said finally. Mrs. Figg blinked. I beg your pardon. He checked his watch. It's nearly 2 in the afternoon. Have you eaten anything? I had a biscuit on the train. Harry turned to Cho. Can we get something from the canteen? Sandwiches or whatever they've got. He pulled out the chair nearest Mrs. Figg and sat down. Not across the table from her, next to her, at the corner of it, close enough that it wasn't an interrogation. Okay, he said, and his voice had leveled out into something that was very calm and very deliberate. Start from the beginning. And I mean the actual beginning. She talked for 2 hours. Harry didn't interrupt. He'd pulled the first journal toward him partway through the first hour, gently, making a wordless question of it, and Mrs. Figg had nodded, and he'd turned pages while she talked, not reading, just touching, the way people sometimes needed to touch evidence to believe it was real. His face gave very little away, but his hands weren't entirely still, and once, around the point where Mrs. Figg was describing the summer of 1995 and what she'd seen the day before the Dementor attack, he put his palm flat on an open page and left it there for a moment like he was checking whether it was warm. Hermione took careful, thorough notes and hated herself for the parts where her handwriting became slightly uneven. "There's something I need to ask," Harry said, when Mrs. Figg reached the year 1998 and paused to reorder her thoughts. "The letters you sent. The 3 letters to the ministry. You said they were never acknowledged." "That's correct." "Did you ever find out if they were received?" Mrs. Figg reached into the canvas bag again and produced another sleeve. Inside it were 3 letters, clearly Muggle in format, typewritten, carbon-copied, with handwritten annotations in the margins. "In 1993, she said, I made contact with a former ministry clerk who had been let go after Voldemort's fall. She was willing to confirm, off the record, that the letters had been received in the Chief Warlock's office. She couldn't confirm what had happened to them after that." She set the sleeve down. "But the fact that nothing changed on Privet Drive tells its own story, I think." "Yes," Harry said. "It does. The 3rd section of Journal 14, Mrs. Figg said, pointing, covers the period between your 1st and 2nd years at Hogwarts. I paid close attention that summer because I had expected, I had hoped, that being at Hogwarts would have changed things. That someone there would have noticed. That the school would have provided some mechanism for, it didn't," Harry said. "No. It didn't." She looked at him with those grey eyes. "The July of that year, Petunia Dursley locked the cat flap on your bedroom door. To pass food through." Harry said it without inflection. "Yes." Cho put her pen down. "I documented the food that went through," Mrs. Figg said. "I couldn't always see the amounts but I could observe timing and frequency. I noted those observations. And I noted that I looked up the relevant Muggle child protection statutes that summer and found that what I had observed over 10 years of documentation would have been more than sufficient for authorities to remove a child from that home, had anyone reported it through the correct Muggle channels." She straightened the journals in front of her very slightly. "I didn't report it through Muggle channels because I had been asked, implicitly and explicitly, to channel any concerns through the Order. And the Order's position was that the blood protection made the Dursleys' home the safest possible place for you." "Who told you that specifically?" Hermione asked. "Dumbledore, in his reply to my 91 letter. He was very gracious about it. Very kind." Her voice was completely level. "He said the sacrificial protection Lily Potter had left in her death was a form of magic that had no equal and that my vigilance was appreciated but that he was confident the arrangements were the best possible ones for Harry's long-term safety." She paused. He used the phrase long-term safety twice in a letter of 6 paragraphs. Harry picked up the journal in front of him, turned to a page near the back, and read something silently. He turned 3 more pages. "Read something else." His expression was very still. "Harry," Hermione said. "I'm fine." He turned another page. "What's the date on the Dumbledore letter?" "The 91 one. July the 29th, 1991. He did the arithmetic. "That's 2 weeks before I went to Diagon Alley for the first time. He wrote this 2 weeks before he met me in person for the first time." He set the journal down. "Or what he let me think was the first time." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Right," Harry said, and stood up. He walked to the covered board on the wall and stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets. He had his back to the room, but his shoulders were perfectly level, and when he spoke his voice was even. "Hermione. What's the procedure here?" Hermione's pen hovered. Formally, we conduct an initial assessment of the evidence to determine whether it supports opening a DMLE investigation into. Given that the primary subject is deceased, the language would be conduct review rather than criminal investigation. We document the chain of custody for all materials. We identify any living persons who may have been materially involved in the decisions documented in the journals. Umbridge was involved. The room went still in a different way. There are 3 entries in Journal 19, Mrs. Figg said carefully, in which I documented communications between Dumbledore and individuals I later identified as ministry officials. One of those officials, I couldn't confirm it at the time, I only confirmed it later, was Dolores Umbridge, then Senior Undersecretary to the Minister. The entries relate to the period just before your 5th year. Harry turned from the board. Her name is on a page. Several pages. He nodded. Something in his posture said he'd expected that, had perhaps known it was there before she told him, and had confirmed it anyway because he was the sort of person who needed to look directly at things rather than around them. I want to read all of them, he said. Every journal. All 32. Harry, Hermione said, and her voice was careful, if you're going to be formally connected to this investigation, there are boundaries on what you can. I'm not asking as an Auror. He looked at Mrs. Figg. I'm asking as the subject of the records. I assume I have a right to that. Mrs. Figg held his gaze. I always intended for you to read them. Then I'll read them. He moved back to the table and sat down, not in the chair he'd had before but in the one directly in front of the trolley, as though proximity to the thing was now the point. But first. He looked around the table, at Hermione, at Proudfoot, at Cho, at Mrs. Figg. I want to say something clearly, before this gets bigger than this room, because it's going to get bigger than this room, and once it does, everyone in it is going to have opinions about what I'm feeling and what I should do and how I should respond to all of this. He gestured at the journals. So while it's still just us. Arabella, he used her first name again, and this time there was something warm in it, something that hadn't been there an hour ago. Thank you. For doing this. For doing all of it. For 30 years. Mrs. Figg, who had spent 30 years being very carefully composed, pressed her lips together for a moment. You were a child, she said. You were a child, and someone should have said so out loud, and in writing, and repeatedly, and I am sorry it was only me. It wasn't only you, Harry said. But you were the one who wrote it down. He looked at the journals. That matters. That turns out to matter enormously. By 5 o'clock, Hermione had 3 reports drafted, a formal chain of custody log for all 32 journals, and a secure room request filed with the DMLE Records Office. Proudfoot had cross-referenced the index volumes against existing DMLE case files and found 4 points of intersection that he flagged with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to have visible feelings during preliminary assessments. Cho had filled half a notepad and started a second one. Harry had read Journal 1 and Journal 2 and had not said anything for the past 90 minutes, which Hermione recognized as the particular silence that meant he was storing things rather than processing them, packing them away to deal with properly later, somewhere that wasn't a professional setting. She sat down next to him around 5:30 with 2 cups of tea. How bad is it? She asked quietly. He turned a page. You know how bad it is. You've got Proudfoot's cross-references. I'm asking how bad it is for you. He accepted the tea. It's strange, he said after a moment. Reading it. Because I remember all of it. But reading it in notes. With dates and times and her observations about what I looked like. He turned another page. It makes it very factual. Is that better or worse? I don't know yet. He turned the journal toward her and pointed at an entry from July 1989. She notes here that she'd seen me in the garden for approximately 3 hours without water on a day that was 28 degrees. And that when she gave me a glass of water through the hedge, I said thank you and drank the whole thing in one go and handed the glass back without mentioning it to the Dursleys. He tapped the page. I remember that day. I remember thinking it was very kind of her. I remember thinking it was. I remember feeling like it was remarkable that someone gave me a glass of water because they noticed I needed it. Not because I asked. He paused. I was 9. Hermione didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. I'm going to see this through, Harry said. All of it. Whatever that means legally, whatever it means for the legacy conversations, all of that. I'm going to see it through. He picked up his tea. Not because I need it. I want to be clear about that. I'm not broken. I'm not sitting here falling apart. He said it without defensiveness, just clarity. But those letters he sent to the Dursleys. The one she photographed in '93. He wrote to them to tell them I'd done something at school and to ask them to make sure the summer was, he used the phrase appropriately challenging. He looked at the wall. I'd like to know what he thought appropriately challenging meant, and I'd like to know it on the record, in front of witnesses. The portrait, Hermione said. The portrait, Harry agreed. From across the room, where she had been sitting quietly since the afternoon had shifted from procedural to something rawer, Arabella Figg watched Harry Potter make the decision she had been waiting 30 years for someone to make, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd almost mistaken it for ordinary breathing. Mrs. Figg, Hermione said, standing and gathering her files, we're going to need to formally take possession of the journals tonight and begin the intake process. You'll be kept fully informed at every stage, and I'm going to assign you a liaison, someone you can contact directly with any questions or additional materials. I have additional materials, Mrs. Figg said. Everyone looked at her. She reached into the canvas bag, which appeared to have been operating on a principle of inexhaustibility that Hermione suspected had undetectable extension charm written all over it, and produced a small, flat parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen string. She set it on the table. Those are photographs of Privet Drive, she said. Taken over 30 years. 1 photograph per year, same position, same angle. You can watch the garden change. You can watch the Dursleys repaint the house in '94. You can watch the boy in the garden get taller. She looked at Harry directly. There's one from every summer between 1983 and 2001. Except for 1997. I wasn't there in '97, Harry said. No. You weren't. And I stood at my window that summer and took a photograph of an empty garden, and I kept it with the others anyway. She folded her hands. It's the most important one, I think. An absence is still evidence. The room was quiet again. Outside in the corridor, the DMLE was beginning its evening shift, people arriving, people leaving, the ordinary machinery of the ministry turning its wheels. Somewhere far above them, London was going about its Tuesday evening. The Muggle world was happening to its 7 million people, none of whom knew that in a middle-sized office on a middle floor of a building disguised as a telephone box, 30 years of a child's life had just been laid out on a table and confirmed, in someone's careful handwriting, to have happened exactly the way he'd always known it had. Right, Harry said. He closed Journal 2 and set it down with the kind of care you gave things that had weight beyond their physical dimensions. He looked at Arabella Figg, and the expression on his face was the one Hermione had only seen a handful of times before, not in battle, not in the dramatic moments that people wrote about. The quiet, clear, absolutely decided look that meant he'd finished calculating and had reached a conclusion and was going to act on it with everything he had. Let's take it apart, he said. All of it. Every page. Let's find out exactly what was known and when and by whom and what they did about it. Let's do it properly. He picked up his tea, finished it, set the mug down. And let's start tonight. Mrs. Figg allowed herself, for the first time all day, a small, genuine smile. It was the smile of a woman who had kept notes on a Tuesday morning in autumn, who had pushed a squeaky-wheeled trolley down a long corridor, who had waited very patiently for exactly this moment, and who had, it turned out, been right all along to believe it would eventually come. I was hoping you'd say that, she said. Chapter 2, Every page the secure room was on the fourth sublevel. Most people in the DMLE didn't know the fourth sublevel existed, which was precisely why Hermione had requested it. It was the kind of space the Ministry reserved for things that needed to be true without being visible, a long, low-ceilinged room with walls charmed to absorb sound, a single door that logged every entry and exit, and lighting that made everything slightly too clear, like the world had been turned up a notch past comfortable. By 9 o'clock Tuesday night, it looked like the inside of a very organized mind. Proudfoot had built the timeline properly now, not the preliminary gesture he'd put on the wall upstairs, but the real thing, running the full length of the room in a continuous strip of dates and notations, each entry color-coded and cross-referenced. Red for documented injuries. Blue for correspondence. Green for Ministry interactions. Yellow for what Proudfoot had labeled, in his careful clerk script, anomalous Dumbledore decisions, a category that had more entries than anyone had expected and that nobody was commenting on directly yet. Harry stood in front of the yellow entries for a long time. Neville arrived at 9:30 with takeaway containers from a Thai place near the Ministry entrance and the particular expression of a man who had been briefed on the way over and hadn't finished deciding what to do with the information. Hermione's message said urgent, he said, setting the containers on the only clear corner of the table. He looked at the room, at the timeline, at the journal spread open at flagged pages, at Harry standing in front of the yellow strip like he was reading a language he'd always half known. This is bigger than urgent. Yeah, Harry said, without turning around. Neville came to stand next to him. He read 3 entries on the yellow strip. He read 4 more. Then he pulled a chair up, sat in it, and said nothing for a moment, because Neville Longbottom had learned in childhood that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was be present without filling the space with words. 93, Harry said, pointing at an entry. She documented a visit to Privet Drive from someone she describes as, he checked the journal. A wizard, late middle age, traveling by Muggle taxi, entering the property at approximately 3 in the afternoon and leaving 40 minutes later. Subject appeared agitated upon departure. No observable interaction with Harry. He looked at Neville. I was in my room. I heard voices downstairs. I assumed it was someone from the Masons. The Dursleys were always doing business dinners with the Masons. He paused. I was in my room because I'd been told to stay there and be quiet and not ruin things. Do you know who it was? Arabella thought it might have been Mundungus Fletcher. Harry moved along the timeline. There's a second visit in 95 that she's more confident about. She got close enough to see his face. He stopped at a blue entry. Arthur Weasley. Neville straightened slightly. He came to collect me for the Quidditch World Cup, Harry said. I knew that part. What I didn't know, what Arabella noted, was that he arrived, spent 7 minutes inside, and that when he left he had a brief conversation with Arabella at her gate where she tried to raise concerns about the house, about the conditions, and he told her. He picked up the journal and read directly. He was kind about it. He said Dumbledore knew best and that the family wasn't ideal but Harry was safe enough. He said it like a man repeating something he'd been told to believe, not like a man who had come to the conclusion himself. The room was quiet except for the slight hum of the sound-absorbing charms. Safe enough, Neville said. Yeah. Harry closed the journal. He sat down across from Neville, pulled a container of food toward him, and opened it, because Harry had long since learned that eating when you could was a practical necessity and also a small act of resistance against the part of you that wanted to make symbolic gestures instead of functional ones. The question is what we do with it. What do you want to do with it? I want to subpoena the portrait. Neville picked up a fork. Hermione's going to have thoughts about that. Hermione's thoughts and my thoughts are going to be the same thoughts. She just needs until morning to get there. She's already there, Hermione said from the doorway. Neither of them had heard her come in. She had the third thick folder of cross-references under one arm and the look of someone who had spent the last 2 hours being very thorough and was now ready to be something other than thorough. She sat down, reached for a container, opened it, and put her fork straight through something without looking at it. I've been going through Proudfoot's cross-references, she said. There are four points where existing DMLE case files intersect with what Arabella documented. Two of them are minor, an incident in '96 involving a Hogwarts student that was closed without action, and a 1992 report filed by, this is remarkable, by Arabella herself, through a Muggle solicitor, to the Muggle Child Protection Services, which she did simultaneously with her second letter to the ministry. She looked up. It was investigated by Muggle Social Services. An officer visited Privet Drive in November '92. Petunia Dursley apparently convinced them everything was fine. The case was closed. She knows people, Neville said. She knows how to perform, Harry said. She's been performing normal her whole life. It was practically her religion. The other two intersections are not minor, Hermione said. She set down her fork. She put the folder on the table and opened it to a section marked with a red tab. The first is from October 1995. There is a DMLE internal memo, marked restricted, which is why Proudfoot had to dig for it, relating to a complaint filed by Arabella Figg about the Dementor incident on Privet Drive. She filed a formal complaint with the DMLE within 4 days of the attack. Harry went still. She was never told the outcome, Hermione said. Because there was no outcome. The complaint was received, logged, and, she turned a page. Filed under a subcategory labeled Complaints, Squib Jurisdiction, which is a subcategory that, as far as I can determine, had never been used before and has never been used since. It was created, it appears, specifically to file this complaint in a place where it would not receive a standard response time. The silence stretched. Who created the subcategory? Harry asked. I'm still establishing that. Her voice was perfectly controlled in the way it got when she was most angry. But the memo authorizing its creation has a countersignature. It's partially obscured, someone has used a deterioration charm on it, which is its own problem, but Proudfoot ran a recovery spell and he got most of it. She turned the folder to face him. Harry read the partial signature. He read it again. He looked at Hermione. That's Umbridge. Yes. Neville put his fork down slowly. She was senior undersecretary at that point. She had administrative authority over departmental filing systems. Hermione pulled the folder back. She used it to bury a formal complaint about an attack that she was, almost certainly, involved in ordering. She closed the folder. This is no longer a conduct review. What is it? Neville asked. I don't know yet. That's what tonight is for. She picked her fork back up. Eat. We're going to be here for a while. They worked through the night. Not in the frantic, coffee-fueled way of people chasing a deadline, but in the methodical, thorough way of people who understood that what they were building needed to hold up under scrutiny from people who would spend a great deal of energy trying to find its weak points. Cho arrived at 11 with 2 colleagues from her team, a quiet, precise wizard named Abernathy who was apparently the department's foremost expert in documentary evidence, and a woman called Priya who did magical trace analysis and who looked at the photographs Arabella had taken with the focused intensity of someone who could see things in images that other people couldn't. Priya held the photograph from August 1987, Harry at 7 in the garden, for a long time. There are charms on the house, she said eventually. Everyone looked at her. Faint. Layered. And old. She spread the photos across the table in order, the 30 annual photographs from 1983 to 2001, minus the empty one from 1997 that sat in its own sleeve. She ran her wand above them in a slow sweep. Look. You can see it in the images if you know what you're looking for. There are charms on the structure of the house that aren't standard domestic magic. There, she frowned. They're containment charms. Modified ones. Containment for what? Harry asked from across the room. Not for the structure. Not for anything coming in. She looked up. For something generating from inside. Something magical. Something generating spontaneously. She met Harry's eyes. They were designed to suppress accidental magic from inside the property. Someone didn't want Harry's accidental magic to be visible from outside the house. The room absorbed this. They didn't want anyone from the ministry picking up the trace, Neville said. If the trace detected the magic and sent someone to investigate, they'd see how he was living, Harry finished. And Dumbledore put those charms on the house, Hermione said. Not a question. I can't confirm the caster yet, Priya said carefully. But the charms date to approximately 1981 to 1982. They predate Arabella's arrival. Harry walked to the table and stood over the photographs. 30 years laid out flat under the two bright lights. He was in most of them, a small shape getting incrementally taller, always in oversized clothes, always slightly to the side of the frame, as though whoever he was near at any given moment had a habit of not quite including him. In the ones from the late 80s, you could sometimes see the shadow of the house falling across him at a particular angle that meant he'd been sitting outside for hours, far enough from the door to be out of the way. He was quiet for a long time. Cho glanced at Hermione. Hermione shook her head slightly. I used to do magic on purpose sometimes, Harry said. Small things. Not on purpose exactly, more like I'd be very angry or very scared and I'd do something, and then I'd wait for the letter from the ministry and it never came. He looked at Priya. I always assumed it was the blood protection. That Dumbledore had found some way to make the ministry less present there. I never thought it was specifically because he didn't want anyone to see what was going on in the house when they came to investigate. He straightened up. What kind of magic would you need to do that? To build a suppression charm that specific? Very advanced, Priya said. Nuanced. You'd need to understand both the trace monitoring system well enough to know what it was looking for, and you'd need to understand the specific magic signature you were trying to suppress. You'd need to know the child. He knew me from the moment I was born, Harry said. The temperature in the room didn't change. But something in it did. At 2 a.m, Harry took a break and went upstairs. Neville followed him, because that was what Neville did, not immediately, giving him 3 minutes first, then finding him sitting on the bench in the corridor near the lifts, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. Harry didn't look up when Neville sat next to him, which meant he'd heard him coming. Say it, Harry said. Say what? Whatever you're thinking. The version where you ask me if I'm alright and I say I'm fine and we both know what that means. Neville considered this. I was actually going to skip that part. Were you? Yeah. I was going to say, the thing about finding out that someone managed your suffering is that it doesn't change the facts of the suffering. What you lived through was real regardless of the documentation. What's real now is that someone wrote it down, and you've got a room full of people who are furious on your behalf, and you're the most capable person I know, and whatever comes next, you don't have to be. He stopped, tried again. You don't have to be measured about it. You're allowed to just be angry. Harry looked at him sideways. I am angry. You're performing calm. I'm performing calm because if I stop performing calm in that room, everyone in there is going to spend their energy worrying about me instead of working. He rubbed the back of his neck. Also because I've been angry about my childhood for 20 years, Neville. This isn't new information that I'm receiving. It's confirmation. It's evidence. And evidence is useful. Anger just sort of burns. Neville was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? Obviously. When they found my parents, when they finally found the evidence that Bellatrix had been tipped off about where they were that night, who gave the ministry information about them, I sat in the hearing room and I watched my gran testify, and she was so composed, and I wanted to. He stopped. I wanted to burn the room down. Not Bellatrix. I'd already dealt with Bellatrix. I mean the room. The institution. The thing that had let it happen without asking the questions it should have asked for 20 years. He looked at his hands. But I didn't, because Gran was so composed, and because I knew that the most painful thing I could do to the people who'd allowed it was to be standing upright when they delivered the verdict. Harry was quiet. "The portrait," Neville said. "You want to ask the portrait?" "I want to ask Dumbledore." "Right. But it's a portrait." "I know what it is." Harry stood up, stretching. "But he built those portraits knowing they'd be asked questions. He chose what to put in them. Whatever version of himself he left in that canvas knew what it was there for." He looked at Neville. "I want to know what it says when someone asks the right questions." Neville stood too. "Then let's go ask for the subpoena." "Not tonight. Tonight we finish the journals." He started back toward the lift. "I want to read every page before I talk to a painting." Journal 14 was from 1993 and 1994. Harry read it in a corner of the secure room while the others worked around him, and he read it the way he'd been reading all of them, with the part of himself that had been a seeker, tracking detail and movement across a wide field, waiting for the thing that would matter. Mrs. Figg's handwriting was consistent across 30 years, small and precise, with occasional moments where the pressure of the pen was heavier than usual, which was the closest she came to editorial comment. There was a section in the middle of Journal 14 that he read 3 times. It was dated July 31, 1994. His 14th birthday. Subject observed in the garden from 7:14 to 12:30. Reading. Book appeared to be a school textbook. He ate a piece of bread and butter at approximately 9 o'clock, he brought it outside in his pocket. The Dursleys left the house at 10 o'clock and did not return until 14:30. Subject remained in the garden for the duration. At approximately 12:45, Subject appeared to notice the date and put the book down and sat with his knees up for some time, not reading. At 1300 hours, Mrs. Number 5 brought a birthday cake to her grandchildren and Subject watched through the hedge. Subject did not appear distressed. He appeared, "I have considered the correct word and I will use it," resigned. I sent him a card with a £5 note. He said thank you in the same tone he always says thank you, which is the tone of a child who has learned to be grateful for small things and has decided that is enough, because the alternative would require too much energy. I find this quality in him both admirable and deeply upsetting. Harry read that paragraph 3 times. Then he turned the page and kept going, because stopping wasn't useful and because Mrs. Figg had kept going too, every day for 30 years, and the least he could do was match her pace. Journal 22 covered the summer after his 5th year at Hogwarts. This one he read faster, and his jaw tightened incrementally as he went, and at one point he stopped on a page and held it up toward the light as though proximity might help, and Neville looked over and said nothing, and Harry turned the page. Mrs. Figg had been watching closely that summer. She'd known what had happened at the ministry. She'd known Sirius was dead. She documented Harry's return to Privet Drive with the particular attention of someone who understood that grief and isolation in the same house was a specific kind of dangerous. July 8, Subject has not left the house today. 3rd consecutive day. I saw him briefly at the upstairs window at approximately 8:30, second window from the right, which I now know to be his room though the door was a cupboard until he was 11, which is its own footnote to 30 years of observation. He looked out for approximately 1 minute and then stepped back from the glass. He looked very tired. He looked the way a person looks when they are not sleeping rather than the way they look when they are sad, though I believe in his case these are the same condition. I considered going to the house. I decided against it. I have considered many times over 30 years whether my presence or absence on any given day made a material difference, and I believe the honest answer is that in moments of acute grief, an elderly Squib neighbor is not what the situation requires. What the situation required was someone from his world. What it received was nothing, for approximately 3 weeks, at which point members of the order arrived in considerable number and removed him from the house with what I can only describe as performative urgency, as though speed of removal at that stage made up for the delay. I noted the date they arrived, July 30th. 1 day before his birthday. Harry closed the journal. He sat for a moment. Hermione was watching him from across the room, the way she'd been watching him all night, not hovering, just present, checking the temperature of something. "Did you know he was watching?" she asked quietly. "Not Dumbledore." She meant, did you know she was watching, from her window, those specific days? No. He set the journal down. "I thought I was just," he stopped. "I thought no one could see me." "She always could." He was quiet. "Then, does it change anything? Knowing she was watching?" Hermione considered this properly, because it was a question that deserved a proper answer. "Not the facts," she said finally. "But maybe the feeling of them." "Yeah." He picked up the next journal. "Yeah, I think so." By 6 in the morning, all 32 journals had been read. Not in full, some of the later ones had been divided among the team, each person taking sections and reporting back on flagged entries, which Abernathy catalogued with his methodical precision into a central summary document that was now 31 pages long. Priya had finished her trace analysis of the photographs and filed a formal report in careful technical language that translated, essentially, to, the suppression charms were deliberate, targeted, old, and powerful enough to have been placed by someone at the peak of their abilities. Harry had read every entry personally related to him. He sat at the end of the table with a mug of tea, someone had made a fresh pot, the ministry canteen unlocked at 5:30 for early shift, and he had a list in front of him, written in his own handwriting, which was still not as neat as Hermione's and never would be. 7 names. People who were referenced in the journals as making decisions, signing documents, visiting the house, or receiving correspondence related to his childhood at Privet Drive. 4 were dead. Dumbledore. Sirius. Moody. Lily Potter's name appeared once, in a note about the original blood protection, written with something adjacent to tenderness in Mrs. Figg's usually clinical prose. 3 were alive. Arthur Weasley, who had known and repeated the approved line. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who as minister had access to records that would either confirm or deny whether the ministry's negligence was active or passive. And Dolores Umbridge, who was currently in a cell in Azkaban and who had filed the suppression complaint in a newly created subcategory designed to disappear it. "We're going to have to involve Kingsley," Harry said. "I know," Hermione said. "He's not going to like it. Nobody is going to like this. That's not a criterion we're working with." She closed her folder. "I'm going to draft the formal petition for a conduct review today. I'll have it ready for the head by afternoon." "Robards?" "He's on leave. Acting head is Savage, which is," she made a face. "I'll deal with Savage if he's difficult," Harry said. "He won't be difficult," she said with the confidence of someone who had navigated the ministry's personality landscape for years. "He'll be cautious. He'll want to know what it costs politically before he decides whether to be brave. The way to handle that is to show him it costs more not to open it." "And Arthur?" Neville asked. This was the first time anyone had said it directly, and the room adjusted slightly around the question, everyone conscious of what it meant. The Weasleys were Harry's family in every way that mattered. Whatever Arthur Weasley had or hadn't done with full knowledge or done because he'd been handed a line he hadn't questioned, it lived in complicated territory. "Arthur's not a target," Harry said. He said it clearly and without hesitation, because it was something he'd thought about during the night. He said what he was told to believe. "That's different. That's something we can talk about." He looked at his list. Umbridge is the target. Umbridge and the institutional decisions that let this happen. Arthur is a witness. He might not want to be. "I know." Harry drank his tea. "I'll talk to him." Cho came through the door from the adjacent room where she'd been working and dropped a file on the table without ceremony. "I found something," she said. "In the index volume. The second index, the one Mrs. Figg calls Category 3, anomalous." She opened the file. There's an entry for 1999. 2 years after Voldemort's defeat. She documents a visit from someone to her own house, not to Privet Drive. Someone came to visit her. Who? Harry asked. She describes him as a representative of the Hogwarts Board of Governors. He asked her whether she had kept any records of her time on Privet Drive. He was very pleasant about it. Cho set the paper down. She told him she hadn't. She said it like someone who'd been asked the question by someone who knew the answer already and was giving her an opportunity to confirm it. Harry set his mug down. She was threatened, Neville said. Gently, Cho said. Very gently. The kind of gentle that means someone is testing whether you're going to be a problem. She looked at Harry. She didn't put the journals away. She moved them. She says in the entry that she put them in a Muggle storage unit in Guildford under a name that wasn't hers, and she updated them by hand from then on and transferred the entries at the end of every year. She paused. She kept going for 2 years after Voldemort died while someone was checking whether she was going to be a problem. The room was quiet. She protected these journals for 30 years, Harry said. Yes. Against everyone who might have wanted them to disappear. Yes. He looked at the stack of journals, all 32, sitting at the end of the table in their careful order, worn and annotated and inarguable. 30 years of a woman sitting in a house in Little Whinging, writing down the truth in small, precise handwriting, every day, not because anyone told her to, not because she knew it would ever matter, but because it was the truth and it wanted recording. We're not going to let that be for nothing, he said. Nobody argued. All right. He stood up, and there was something in him that had settled overnight, not into grief, not into rage, but into something cleaner and more purposeful than either. Hermione, get the petition drafted. Neville, I want to look at the Umbridge case files, everything she's been charged with, what's already on record, and what we can cross-reference with what Arabella documented. Cho, I want a full analysis of those suppression charms, caster identification, method, materials if possible, anything that can go on the record. He looked at Abernathy, who nodded without being asked. And I need to go see someone. Where are you going? Hermione asked. Wisteria Walk. He picked up his coat. She sat in a room answering questions for 14 hours yesterday. She's 78 years old and she went home alone. He looked at Hermione. She doesn't have anyone. She never had anyone in all of this. She just had 32 journals and the ability to keep going. Hermione looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, small, genuine, the kind she didn't use professionally. Tell her the sandwiches were good, she said. She looked like she appreciated the sandwiches. He was already at the door. The October morning outside was cold and pale, the sky over London the color of old silver, and Harry Potter walked out into it with his list of 7 names and 32 journals worth of evidence and the absolute, grounded, unshakable certainty of a man who has spent a night reading the truth about himself and has come out the other side not diminished by it, but clarified. He apparat to Wisteria Walk at 6:47 in the morning. The street was quiet. Number 7 had lights on, she was already up, because she had always been an early riser, because 30 years of watching a house had made her someone who kept watch even in her own home. He knocked on the door. She opened it in a green cardigan, a different green cardigan than yesterday's, which meant she owned at least 2, and she looked at him with those sharp gray eyes and said, "You've been up all night." "Yes," he said. "Come in," she said. "I've got tea on." He went in, because she had tea and he needed it, and because there were things he wanted to say to her in a kitchen that wasn't a government room, and because she had watched over him for 30 years and she deserved someone to come to her door on a cold October morning and choose to be there. Behind him, in the secure room on the 4th sublevel, 32 journals sat in their careful order on a government table and waited to be heard. Chapter 3, The Living and the Dead. The portrait hung in the headmistress's office at Hogwarts, 3rd from the left on the south wall, in a gilded frame that someone had clearly polished recently, too recently, Harry thought, when he saw the shine on it. Someone had known they were coming. Minerva McGonagall was behind her desk when they arrived, and she had the look of a woman who had not slept particularly well and was not going to mention it. She'd received Hermione's formal subpoena notice the previous evening and had sent back a response that was technically cooperative and emotionally glacial, 2 sentences in her precise handwriting confirming that she would facilitate access to the portrait of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore in accordance with her obligations under Wisingamot procedural statute. 2 sentences. McGonagall, who had written Harry 17-page letters when he'd been negotiating his Auror training deferment, had sent 2 sentences. Minerva, Harry said. Harry. She stood, and there was something in how she did it, not the formal straightening of a headmistress receiving official visitors, but the instinctive rising of a woman who had known him since he was 11 and was currently fighting with herself about it. Hermione. I've arranged for the office to be available for as long as you need it. I'll be downstairs. You don't have to leave, Harry said. I think it's better if I do. She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame, and turned back. Her eyes went to the portrait briefly, just briefly, and then to Harry. He loved you, she said. Whatever this, she stopped. He did. I know, Harry said. She left. The door clicked shut, and the office settled into the particular quiet of a room full of sleeping portraits, older headmasters and headmistresses dozing in their frames, or pretending to doze, because portrait sleep was as much performance as rest, and Harry had always suspected they listened to everything. Outside, the October sky pressed grey and cold against the windows. The lake was a flat pewter sheet in the distance. Everything about this place was designed to make you feel small and long-preceded, and Harry was conscious of it in the way you were conscious of a hand on your shoulder, present, weighing something, requiring acknowledgement. Hermione had her files. Neville was by the door. Cho was off to the side with a quick quotes quill set to accurate transcription only, which was a setting that required a countercharm Hermione had developed specifically for this kind of proceeding. Harry pulled a chair up directly in front of the portrait. He sat down. He looked at the painting. It looked back at him. Dumbledore in the portrait was exactly as Harry remembered him, the long silver beard, the half-moon spectacles, the robes the color of deep twilight, the hands folded with that particular serenity that had always managed to seem both genuine and curated. The eyes were the same remarkable blue, even in paint, and they were open and attentive in a way that most of the other portraits weren't, which meant either the portrait was a very good one or the painted Dumbledore had been waiting. Probably both. Harry, the portrait said. Its voice was warm, measured, exactly right. It is very good to see you. I'm going to skip the pleasantries, Harry said. We're here under formal DMLE subpoena, this session is being transcribed, and everything you say is on the record. Do you understand? A small pause. I do. Good. Harry leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had conducted hundreds of interviews and knew precisely the posture that said I'm not in a hurry and I'm not impressed. I want to ask you about Privet Drive. The portrait was quiet for a moment. A complex subject. It'll get more complex. Start with the night you left me there. November 1981. What was your reasoning? You know my reasoning. The blood protection. I know the explanation you gave everyone. I'm asking about your reasoning. The actual calculus. Harry kept his voice conversational. Because Arabella Figg's journals document 30 years of conditions in that house, and they raise a question I'd like you to answer, which is this: you were the most powerful wizard of your generation, you had order members, ministry contacts, resources, and you chose a solution that put a 1-year-old child in a home that you knew, within 2 years, was causing him harm. So what was the reasoning? Not the explanation. The reasoning. The portrait turned its gaze slightly, not away, just slightly aside, the gesture of someone collecting their thoughts, and Harry recognized it because he had seen it 100 times in person, had always taken it for wisdom manifesting in real time, and now read it differently. The protection was real, the portrait said. Lily's sacrifice created something I could not replicate with any other magic. Voldemort could not touch him while he remained in Petunia's house. That was not a constructed story, Harry. It was true. I believe you, Harry said. Keep going. Another small pause, and this one felt different, less collected, more navigated. The alternative placements I considered carried significant risks. A wizarding home would be known to Voldemort's remaining supporters. An unknown Muggle placement would have severed the blood connection. You considered alternatives? Yes. Name one. I beg your pardon. Name one specific alternative placement you considered. Harry's voice was still conversational. You've told me you weighed the options. I'd like to hear one of the options you weighed. The portrait was quiet. Because here's what Arabella documented, Harry said. She documented the house. She documented the conditions. She documented that she sent letters to your office in 1984 and 1985 and you didn't respond. She documented a letter she sent directly to you in 1991 in which she described 8 years of observations and raised specific concerns, and she has your reply in a protective sleeve in a DMLE evidence room right now. He put his elbows on his knees. In your reply, you used the phrase appropriately challenging. You wrote to her, in writing, which she tells me was unusual for you, that the arrangements, while not ideal, were appropriately challenging for a child who would face significant trials. Can you tell me what you meant by that? Silence. Not the collected kind. The other kind. He needed to be humble, the portrait said finally. The voice was the same warm, measured tone, but underneath it now something was operating that hadn't been there before, not guilt exactly, but something that portrait paint could not quite fully conceal. He needed to understand sacrifice, hardship, the weight of what was required of him. A sheltered, celebrated childhood, would have made me what? Harry asked. Too happy. Too secure. Too, what, exactly, was the risk? Too, unprepared. For dying. Harry said it without any particular weight. Just a fact. You needed me unprepared to die easily, or you needed me hard enough to go willingly. That isn't uncharitable, is it inaccurate? The portrait said nothing. Hermione, to Harry's left, was writing. Her quill was very quiet on the parchment and her face was very still. I want to talk about the suppression charms, Harry said. The ones on the house. The ones designed to absorb magical trace from inside the building so that if I generated accidental magic, the Ministry's monitoring systems wouldn't detect it. The portrait's expression shifted, minimally, barely, but Harry was watching for it. The trace on an underage wizard would have sent Ministry investigators to Privet Drive if triggered. Investigators who would have seen the house. Who might have asked questions. He tilted his head. The charms went on in 1981 or 1982. Before Arabella arrived. You put them there the same night you put me there, or very shortly after. You were protecting the secret of the house, not the child in it. I was protecting the secrecy of the blood protection from those who might. The suppression was targeted at the interior of the house. Specifically. Priya Kapoor, our magical trace analyst, has filed a 14-page report on the architecture of those charms, and she's happy to present it. Harry gestured at Cho, who held up the report. The charms were designed to prevent outward detection of magic generated by a specific individual. Not to prevent detection from outside. To prevent detection from inside going out. He paused. That's containment, not protection. The portrait looked at him. And for a moment, just a moment, the warmth in those painted eyes did something complicated, and what came through was not the curated serenity of Dumbledore in his wisdom but something older and more honest, a man who had made a decision and had known, at some level, exactly what it was, and had decided to live with it because the alternative was reconsidering a plan he'd been building for years. You were a remarkable child, the portrait said quietly. That's not an answer. No. It paused. No, it isn't. Were you aware, Harry said, still conversational, still unhurried, that in the summer of 1993, someone, possibly Mundungus Fletcher, possibly someone else, visited Privet Drive and spent 40 minutes inside and left in what Arabella described as an agitated state? And that no record of that visit exists in any order documentation she's been able to find? Silence. Were you aware that in October 1995, Arabella filed a formal complaint with the DMLE about the Dementor attack on my cousin and me, and that complaint was buried in a fabricated filing subcategory that has Dolores Umbridge's countersignature on its creation memo? I was not aware of that specific. Were you aware Umbridge ordered that attack? I had suspicions. Did you report those suspicions? Silence. Did you? Harry leaned forward slightly. Did you report anything, at any point, through any official channel, regarding the conditions at Privet Drive? The portrait was quiet for a long time. No, it said finally. The word dropped into the room like something very small and very heavy. Why? Harry asked. Because the moment those conditions became officially documented, the portrait said, and now it sounded almost like confession, or as close as painted canvas and trapped memory could get to it, the moment anyone in an official capacity wrote down what was happening in that house, there would have been pressure to remove you from it. And the blood protection required your presence. And the plan, it stopped. The plan required me to stay, Harry said. Yes. The plan, the full plan, the one that ended with me walking into the forest, required me to experience enough of what that house was, to be shaped by it in specific ways. Required me not to be too loved, not too anchored to life, not too, that is not, is it inaccurate? The painted eyes looked at him and didn't answer, and the silence was its own kind of answer, and Harry sat with it for a moment, giving it the weight it deserved without letting it become more than that, without letting it become the thing that knocked him sideways, because he had decided somewhere around 3 in the morning in a secure room in the ministry that he was not going to be knocked sideways by this. He was going to be standing when it was over. Last question, he said. In November 1999, a representative of the Hogwarts Board of Governors visited Arabella Figg at her home and asked whether she had kept records of her time on Privet Drive. She told him she hadn't. At the time of that visit, you had been dead for 3 years. He looked at the portrait levelly. So who sent that representative? The portrait said nothing for a very long time. I don't know, it said finally. Can't or won't. I genuinely do not know. And this, Harry thought, was probably true. A portrait's knowledge was limited to what it had been given in life, and whatever had happened in 1999 had happened after. But I would suggest, the portrait added carefully, that the people most invested in controlling what Arabella had written were not necessarily people loyal to me. They were people who were afraid of what my decisions said about the institutions they still controlled. Harry looked at it. That's the most useful thing you've said. He stood up. He looked at the portrait for a moment longer, at this painted version of a man he had loved and grieved and complicated and forgiven and was now in the process of holding accountable, all of which could be true simultaneously, all of which were true simultaneously, because life was rarely clean enough to permit you only one feeling at a time. For what it's worth, the portrait said quietly, as Harry turned away, I believed it was necessary. I believe that still, in the way that this, it seemed to gesture at itself, at the paint and canvas, is capable of belief. I did not enjoy what was required. Harry stopped. He turned back. I know you believed it was necessary, he said. That's the part that makes it worth documenting. Not the cruelty. There are crueler people in this story, people who enjoyed it, people like Umbridge who didn't need a plan as a justification. What makes your part worth putting on the record is that you were someone who could have done otherwise, and you chose not to, and you called it love. He held the portrait's gaze. I'm not here to hate you. I'm here to make sure that what you chose gets written down properly, so that the next person who needs a justification for managing a child suffering in the name of a greater purpose doesn't get to point at Albus Dumbledore and call it precedent. He turned and walked to the door. Neville opened it. Thank you for your cooperation, Hermione said to the portrait, in her DMLE voice. She closed her files. We may require a second session. Of course, the portrait said. Its voice was very quiet. They left. McGonagall was in the corridor, waiting at a distance that was technically casual and actually wasn't. She looked at Harry's face when he came out, the way she had always looked at his face, taking inventory, checking damage, and something in her own face changed very slightly. "Well," she said. "He confirmed the suppression charms," Harry said. "He confirmed he never reported anything through official channels. He confirmed the plan required me to stay in that house." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to denounce him publicly, Minerva. I'm not asking you to do anything except not obstruct. I would never obstruct, I know." He said it simply. "That's why I'm not asking." She looked at him for a long moment. "He did love you, Harry. I need you to know that I believe that." "I know he did." Harry adjusted the collar of his coat. "That's the complicated part, isn't it? It would be a lot simpler if he hadn't." McGonagall pressed her lips together. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere down a staircase, students were moving between classes, the ordinary noise of Hogwarts carrying up through the stone. "The 1999 visit," Hermione said. "The representative from the Board of Governors who visited Mrs. Figg. Do you know anything about that?" McGonagall's expression shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Hermione had spent 7 years at Hogwarts studying this woman's face across a classroom and she caught it. "Minerva," she said. "I was told," McGonagall said carefully, "in early 1999, by 2 members of the Board of Governors, that they were aware of a Squib operative who had been monitoring Privet Drive and that they were concerned about the reputational implications if any such records became public in the immediate post-war period. I told them I would not be party to any intimidation of Order members." She paused. "I assumed they had not followed through." "They did," Harry said. "I see." She straightened. "Then I owe Arabella Figg an apology." "Yes," Harry said. "You do. And she's in Little Whinging and she drinks builder's tea." McGonagall looked at him with something in her expression that was grief and respect and the complicated love of someone who had watched a boy become a man through the specific lens of institutional guilt. "I'll go on the weekend," she said quietly. Harry nodded. He and Neville and Hermione started down the corridor, and he didn't look back at the portrait room, because he'd said what he'd come to say and looking back wasn't the kind of thing he did anymore. They were halfway down the moving staircase when Cho's mirror activated. She answered it, listened for 10 seconds, and looked up. "It's Proudfoot," she said. "Something's happened." They operated back from Hogsmeade to the Ministry in 3 pops and were in the secure room inside 4 minutes. Proudfoot was standing at the timeline wall with a piece of parchment that he'd affixed at the very end of the yellow strip, past all the other entries, where there was fresh space. "This came in an hour ago," he said. "Delivered by Owl, addressed to the DMLE Investigations Division, no return sender." The owl was a Ministry owl, someone borrowed it internally. Hermione took the parchment. Harry read it over her shoulder. It was short. 3 sentences, in a typeface that had been charmed to be untraceable, not handwriting, not a standard typewriter, but something in between. "You are looking in the right direction but at the wrong people. The 1999 visitor was not acting for the Board of Governors. Check the Malfoy Estate Trust records from 1998 through 2001. Harry straightened up. "Malfoy," Neville said. "Lucius was in Azkaban in 1999, Hermione said immediately. "He was still serving his sentence." "Draco wasn't," Harry said. Everyone looked at him. "He was 20 in 1999, Harry said. He'd been acquitted. He had the family estate, the family connections, and a very strong reason to want Dumbledore's legacy to remain intact." He paused. "Because if Dumbledore's decisions get scrutinized, everything Dumbledore's decisions enabled gets scrutinized. Including the calculations that led to the Malfoy family not being prosecuted more severely after the war." "The deal," Cho said slowly. "The deal. Narcissa's testimony. The way the Wisingamot proceedings went. All of it happened in the shadow of Dumbledore's legacy, this idea that his version of events, his judgments, his calculations were essentially infallible. If you undermine that, Harry looked at the anonymous note. If you undermine that, you open every decision he made to re-examination. Including the ones that benefited people who are currently living very comfortably. Draco sent this note, Hermione said. Not quite certain. Almost. Or someone in his circle who wants the investigation to move faster than it's currently moving. Harry looked at the note. Which is interesting. Because why would he want that? Unless, Neville said slowly, he's not trying to protect the Dumbledore legacy anymore. Unless something changed. Check the estate records, Harry said to Proudfoot. Everything from 1998 to 2001. Financial, legal, trustee documentation. Who was acting on behalf of the Malfoy estate when Lucius was incarcerated, and whether any of that activity connects to the Board of Governors. He turned to Cho. I need you to cross-reference the name of the governor who visited Arabella against every Malfoy-affiliated trust and foundation you can find. Go as many layers deep as you need to go. Cho was already writing. Hermione, Harry said. How soon can we have the formal conduct review opened? If Savage signs off today, we can have it opened by tomorrow morning. Has Savage seen the portrait transcript? She pulled the morning's transcription from her files and handed it to him without a word. He looked at it, the key sections, the confirmations, the silence where there should have been answers. He'll sign today, Harry said. He put the transcript back in her hands. He looked at the timeline on the wall, red for injuries, blue for correspondence, green for ministry interactions, yellow for Dumbledore's decisions, and now a new note at the end, white parchment on bare wall, pointing towards something that hadn't had a color yet. We're going to need a new color, he said. What for? Neville asked. For the people who tried to bury this after he died. Harry looked at the timeline. Because it turns out the cover-up didn't die with him. It kept going. And that means there are people alive right now who have been actively working to make sure none of this ever came to light, and they've been doing it for 20 years, and they are the part of this story that is an actual crime. The room was very quiet. Orange, Cho said. Everyone looked at her. For the post-mortem suppression, she said, completely practically. Red's injuries, yellow's Dumbledore, orange can be the cover-up. Color theory. Neville looked at her. Why orange? It's a warning color, she said, and stuck an orange flagged note at the end of the timeline. Savage signed the conduct review petition at 3:30. He did it the way Hermione had predicted, cautiously, with 3 requests for clarification and 1 attempt to suggest the review focus only on ministry institutional process rather than named individuals, which Hermione declined by producing the portrait transcript and setting it on his desk and waiting while he read it. He read it twice. The second time through, his expression went through several phases that Harry watched from the doorway without comment. The portrait confirmed the suppression charms were deliberate, Savage said. Yes, Hermione said. And the Umbridge countersignature on the filing subcategory is in Proudfoot's cross-reference report, section 4. Savage sat for a moment. He was a broad, grey-faced man who had been an Auror for 25 years and had the cautious pragmatism of someone who had survived several changes of political weather by being slightly less visible than his convictions. He looked at Harry in the doorway. This is going to be enormous, he said. Yes, Harry said. The press, will find out eventually. We'd rather it be on our terms. Savage looked at the transcript again. He said the plan required you to stay in the house. He said it like he needed to confirm he'd read it correctly. He did. Savage signed the petition. He handed it to Hermione and then looked out his window at the ministry atrium below, where a dozen people were crossing the floor in the ordinary business of a Wednesday afternoon, completely unaware that 4 floors up, something had just been set in motion that would require all of them to eventually decide what they thought about the wizard on the chocolate frog cards. I'll need to brief the minister, Savage said. I'll do it, Harry said. Kingsley and I can have that conversation directly. Savage looked relieved in the way of men who are glad to have a complicated task moved off their desk. Right. Yes. That would be, he nodded. Yes. Harry took the signed petition from Hermione, tucked it under his arm, and walked out of Savage's office with it. The lift down to his floor was empty. Neville was already gone, heading to retrieve the Malfoy estate records from the legal archives. Hermione had turned left toward her own office to file the petition properly with the Wizengamot clerk. Cho was back in the secure room, color-coding the new developments in orange. Harry stood in the lift as it descended, petition under his arm, and let himself have 30 seconds of something that wasn't calm and wasn't composure and wasn't the measured professional demeanor he'd been maintaining across 48 hours of revelations. He stood in the lift and breathed. The portrait had confirmed it. Out loud, on record, in Dumbledore's own voice, or what passed for it, the truth that he'd been building a shape around in his own head for 20 years without ever quite letting himself say directly, the suffering hadn't been a side effect. It had been a calculation. And then Harry put that away, not dismissed, not buried, but properly placed, exactly where it needed to be, accessible when the moment required it and contained in the meantime, and straightened up. The lift reached his floor. He walked to his office, sat down at his desk, and pulled out a fresh piece of parchment. He wrote one line, "Kingsley, we need to talk. Today. It's about Dumbledore." He folded it, sent it by ministry memo, and turned to the stack of files on his desk, case files, Auror work, the ordinary ongoing business of catching people who did wrong in the present tense. He worked through them steadily until the reply came back 20 minutes later. "My office. 5 o'clock. I'll have tea." Harry looked at the note for a moment. Then he looked at the window, at London outside in its grey autumn coat, at the city doing its millions of indifferent ordinary things, and he thought about a woman in a green cardigan writing down the date at the top of a journal page on a Tuesday morning in 1983 and beginning a sentence with subject observed at. He put it in his pocket and kept working. At 4:15, a complication arrived. It arrived in the form of a memo slipped under the secure room door, found by Cho when she came back from the archives. She read it, went very still for a moment, and then walked directly to Harry's office without stopping. "We have a problem," she said. Harry looked up from his files. "Define problem." "Someone leaked." She put the memo on his desk. "Rita Skeeter has a source inside the DMLE. This memo is from our press liaison. She received a call from the Daily Prophet 40 minutes ago. Skeeter is asking for comment on," she indicated the memo, "on an alleged DMLE investigation into Albus Dumbledore's role in the childhood treatment of Harry Potter." Harry read the memo. He read it twice. He set it down. "She doesn't have much yet," Cho said. "She's got the existence of journals, the word Dumbledore, and Harry's name. That's it." "That's enough for a front page tomorrow morning," Harry said. "Yes." He sat back. He turned the situation over. "Then, call her." Cho blinked. "I'm sorry." "Call Skeeter directly. Today. Offer her an interview, not for immediate publication, not for the front page tomorrow. Offer her the exclusive when we're ready to go public, in exchange for holding what she has until then." He looked at Cho. "She won't bury it forever. But she'll hold it for a week if she thinks she's getting the full story rather than the scraps. She's a better journalist than people give her credit for, and she knows the difference between a scoop and a story. What if she says no? She won't. She's been waiting 20 years for something like this, and she knows it." He stood up, pulling on his coat. "Don't promise her anything about timing. Just promise her access. And if she's already written it?" Harry moved to the door. "Then we accelerate everything. The inquest petition goes to the Wizengamot clerk tonight, not next week. We don't get to control the pace if she publishes tomorrow morning." He paused. "But she hasn't published yet, or the press liaison wouldn't be asking for comment, she'd be managing a crisis. Skeeter called first. That means she wants something. She wants the story, Cho said. No, Harry said. She wants the story. There's a difference. Make the call. He left for Kingsley's office. The hallways of the ministry were the same hallways they'd always been, wide and high-ceilinged and slightly pompous, full of people who carried the weight of institutional importance and the slightly harried expression of people who had too many meetings. Harry walked through them with the conduct review petition under his arm and Mrs. Figg's 32 journals in evidence storage and a portrait's confirmed admission in a transcription file, and he thought about what Kingsley would say, and he thought about what he would say back, and he thought about the 1999 visit to Wisteria Walk and the anonymous note pointing at the Malfoy estate, and he thought about orange flags on a timeline wall, and underneath all of that, steady as a pulse, he kept hearing those two words from the portrait in the gilded frame. Appropriately challenging. He turned the corner toward the minister's office. He knocked. Come in, Kingsley said. Harry went in. Chapter 4. What Umbridge knows. Kingsley Shacklebolt had been Minister for Magic for 8 years, and in that time he had navigated a post-war reconstruction, 3 separate attempts at Wisengamot reform, a dragon smuggling ring that had briefly destabilized 3 countries, and the ongoing political theater of a wizarding Britain that was simultaneously trying to be better than it had been and deeply uncomfortable with what being better required. He was, by any measure, a formidable man. Tall, broad, with a voice that had always carried the particular authority of someone who spoke infrequently enough that when he did, people listened. He'd been an Auror before politics. He knew how evidence worked. He read the conduct review petition in 4 minutes flat, which was fast, and then he put it down on his desk and looked at Harry across the tea he'd promised, and Harry watched him do the thing that capable people did when they were handed something that was going to cost them. He weighed it, measured it, turned it over, and then he made his face go very still. The portrait confirmed it, Kingsley said. On record. Transcribed. The suppression charms. Dated to 1981. Specifically targeted to prevent internal magic generating outward trace. Kingsley picked up his tea. He was quiet for a moment. Outside his office window, the late afternoon was turning the sky over London a shade of dark amber, and it lit the room from one side, and Harry let it sit, because Kingsley needed the space to process and pushing wouldn't help. You know what this does, Kingsley said finally. To the legacy, yes. To more than the legacy. The Wisengamot sentencing framework for 37 post-war cases relied in part on testimony that referenced Dumbledore's judgment as corroborating evidence. If we open his decision-making to formal review, some of those cases get complicated, Harry said. I know. Some of those people might petition for review. Some of them might deserve it. Harry set his tea down. Kingsley. I'm not asking you to take a position on Dumbledore's character. I'm asking you to let the process run. Formally. Transparently. With the DMLE conducting an inquest that the Wisengamot oversees. That's what's supposed to happen when there's documented evidence of institutional negligence. Harry, he left a 1-year-old child in an abusive home and suppressed the evidence that would have triggered a welfare investigation, Harry said. He did it deliberately. He documented his reasoning in correspondence. A woman spent 30 years writing it all down and twice came close to having those records destroyed by people who knew exactly why they needed to not exist. He looked at Kingsley steadily. You are one of the best people I know. You're also the minister. Those two things are going to need to be the same person in this room tonight. Kingsley put his tea down too. He looked at Harry for a long moment. Not the institutional look of minister to citizen, but the older look, the one from order days, from the war, from the particular bond of people who had been through the same fire and come out with a shared understanding of what mattered. Tell me about Umbridge, he said. Proudfoot's cross-references found her counter-signature on the creation of a false filing subcategory used to suppress Arabella's 1995 complaint about the Dementor attack. We believe she ordered the attack. We believe she used her administrative authority as senior undersecretary to bury the complaint before anyone senior could see it. Harry paused. She's been in Azkaban for 8 years on existing charges. This adds to the picture significantly. Her lawyer filed a petition for sentence review 6 months ago, Kingsley said. Harry went very still. It hasn't been publicly announced, Kingsley said. It's at the preliminary stage. But she's been cooperative in ways that her counsel is presenting as evidence of rehabilitation, and there's a vocal contingent. He stopped himself. I need you to know that before you go any further. Because if this investigation reveals additional charges against her, that petition becomes more complicated. More complicated how? She could use it as leverage. Her lawyer is smart. If the choice becomes new charges versus existing testimony she could offer on other cases, no deal, Harry said. Harry, that's not, no deal, he said again, and his voice was completely even. I've heard the argument. I understand the tactical case for using her. I'm telling you that the answer is no, and I want that on the record too, so that when her lawyer eventually makes that offer formally, the DMLE's position is already established. He looked at Kingsley. She spent years of her life making children afraid. She ran a torture program at a school. She ordered Dementors to attack civilians including me when I was 15 years old. She does not get to be useful. She gets to be accountable. Kingsley was quiet. I'll support the formal inquest, he said. I'll have my office issue a statement of ministerial non-interference, which means the process runs independently, which means if it goes places that are politically inconvenient, the ministry doesn't obstruct. Thank you. I'm also going to need you to be careful with the Malfoy angle. His eyes sharpened. Because the moment Malfoy, any Malfoy, becomes publicly adjacent to this, it becomes a different story. It becomes a war crime story, which is a different story from the accountability story, and one of them is easier to follow and one of them is easier to hijack. Draco may have sent us the note pointing at his own estate records, Harry said. Kingsley blinked. This was clearly new information. Or someone in his circle who wants to move faster than we are, Harry said. I don't know yet. But if he sent that note, it means he's decided the Dumbledore legacy is more of a liability to him than an asset, and that changes the calculation. Or he's setting a trap, Kingsley said. Or that. Harry stood. Either way, I'll find out. He picked up his coat. The press situation, Cho is calling Skeeter tonight. If we can hold her for a week, we have time to get the inquest formally convened before it goes public. If not, we're doing this in the papers before we're ready. Then we'd better be ready. He moved to the door. Thank you for the tea. Harry. Kingsley's voice stopped him at the door. For what it's worth, this is right. What you're doing. It's right. Harry looked back at him. I know, he said simply. That's why it's taking a while. He went to Azkaban on Thursday morning, and he went alone. This was a fact that Hermione discovered at 6:45 a.m. when she arrived at the secure room and found Neville already there with coffee and the particular expression of someone who had been informed of a decision he disagreed with but had decided not to fight. He left an hour ago, Neville said. Hermione set down her files. Did he tell you he was going? He told me last night. Neville handed her a coffee. He said he needed to do it before the formal investigation made it procedurally complicated. It's already procedurally complicated, we're in the middle of Hermione. Neville looked at her. He's not going for the investigation. He's not going to interrogate her. He knows what she knows. He paused. He's going because he wants her to know she lost. Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. Right, she said finally. She sat down and opened her files. Azkaban in October was a specific kind of unpleasant. The fortress sat in the North Sea like a bad idea that had solidified, and the boat that ferried official visitors to it moved through water the color of cold iron under a sky that wasn't quite raining but hadn't committed to stopping either. Harry stood at the bow in his Auror robes with his hands in his pockets and watched the fortress grow on the horizon, and he didn't feel anything in particular about being here, which was different from the first time he'd made this trip after the war, when the Dementors had been removed and the place had been staffed with human guards and was theoretically less terrible than it had been, and he'd still had to grip the railing on the way over. He felt fine now. He just wanted to have a conversation. The guard on Umbridge's wing was a solid, humorless witch named Ferris who had processed his credentials with the efficiency of someone who had seen Aurors arrive for unusual requests before and had developed a personal policy of not asking questions unless explicitly required. "Alone?" she said. "Alone," Harry confirmed. "She's been," Ferris paused, choosing her word. "Anticipatory. Since yesterday afternoon. Like she knew something was coming." "She's smart," Harry said. "She would have picked up the shift in ministry atmosphere even from in here. She has contacts." Ferris looked like she wanted to say something about that but settled for leading him down the corridor without further comment. The wing smelled of damp stone and the particular chemical cleanness of a place that was regularly disinfected and would never quite smell clean. The cells here were individual, larger than the old Azkaban configurations. Reform had reached this far at least, with narrow windows that admitted grey light and a door with a viewing slot that guards used for welfare checks. Ferris opened the door. 30 minutes, she said. "I won't need that long," Harry said. He went in. Dolores Umbridge was 64 years old and looked it in the particular way of someone whose manner had always done most of the work of their appearance. In her ministry heyday she had been a presence, the pink, the carefully arranged hair, the smile that was all surfaces and no warmth, the physical performance of harmless femininity deployed as a weapon. In a prison cell in an institution grey shift, without the costume, she looked like a woman who had been reduced to her skeleton and was not pleased about it. She was sitting in the chair at the small table, hands folded, and her eyes when Harry came in were the same as they'd always been, sharp, small, calculating, the eyes of someone who never stopped measuring the room. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been right about something. "Mr. Potter," she said. Her voice was still smooth. Still carrying, underneath everything, that quality of performance, that sense of someone who had never entirely stopped performing even alone in a room. "I wondered when you'd come." Harry sat in the chair across from her. He looked at her. She looked back. "No files," she said. "No recording quill. This isn't official." "No," Harry said. "Then what is it?" "It's personal." He settled back in his chair with the ease of a man who was completely comfortable. "I wanted to see your face." Something moved behind her eyes, and she covered it immediately. She was good, she'd always been good, this was the woman who had run a torture program with perfect paperwork and called it educational, but Harry caught it. Not fear. She wasn't afraid of him. Something else. The particular unease of a predator who recognizes that the landscape has changed in ways they haven't fully mapped yet. "My lawyer," she began. "Your lawyer's petition is going to get considerably more complicated in the next week," Harry said pleasantly. "Not because of anything I'm doing, the conduct review is Hermione Granger's case, not mine, and she'll follow the evidence wherever it goes with complete institutional impartiality. But the evidence is going to go some places your lawyer hasn't accounted for." He paused. The 1995 complaint. Arabella Figg's formal complaint to the DMLE about the Dementor attack. Nothing changed in her face. Absolutely nothing. Which was its own answer. "We found the filing subcategory," Harry said. "We found your countersignature on the memo that created it. Proudfoot's done a documentary recovery on the deterioration charm you put on that signature. By the way, turns out charm deterioration is actually quite reversible with current techniques. Something you might not have known when you applied it." Still nothing. She was extraordinarily controlled. "What I find interesting," Harry said, "is the timing. You created that subcategory within 72 hours of the complaint being filed. Which means you were watching for it. You knew Arabella was going to file something, which means you knew she had observed something, which means you knew, or suspected, that she'd been keeping records. "I don't know what you're talking about," Umbridge said, and her voice was perfectly smooth. "You don't have to." Harry looked at her without hostility, which he suspected was the thing she found most unsettling. She was calibrated for people who came in angry, who gave her something to work with. "I'm not here to interrogate you. I told you, this is personal." "Then what do you want?" "I want you to know what's coming," Harry said. "Not as a threat. As information." He leaned forward slightly. "We have the journals. We have 32 years of documented evidence that Arabella Figg kept in a Muggle storage unit in Guildford for part of that time, specifically because someone came to her house in 1999 and asked whether she had records. We have the portrait transcript. We have Proudfoot's cross-references. We have Priya Kapoor's trace analysis of the suppression charms. We have your signature on a document you tried to destroy." He paused. "We are going to convene a formal Wisengamot inquest. Arabella Figg is going to testify. I am going to testify. The conduct review is going to become a matter of public record." He watched her. She was very still. "And here's the thing I actually came to tell you," Harry said. "Your lawyer is going to receive an offer in the next few days. The DMLE is going to ask whether you'd like to provide testimony on the 1995 Dementor attack and related matters in exchange for certain considerations on your sentence review." He paused. "The answer is no." Umbridge blinked. "I beg your pardon. We don't need your testimony. We have sufficient evidence on the Dementor attack from other sources. We always had sufficient evidence, which is one of the reasons your lawyer's petition was never going to succeed regardless, but that's a conversation for another day." He stood up. "My point is that there is no deal on the table. There isn't going to be a deal. You're not going to be given an opportunity to make yourself useful, and you are not going to walk out of this inquest with a reduced sentence and a story about how you cooperated with the investigation." Something happened in her face then. It was small, the tiniest fracture in the surface, and it was the look of a very smart, very controlled person who had spent 48 hours calculating the possibilities of a situation and had just had one significant variable removed from her calculations. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Possibly. I make them sometimes." He picked up his coat from where he'd slung it over the back of the chair. "But I've been making decisions about how to handle you for 15 years, and they've worked out tolerably well." He moved toward the door. "You know what the worst part of it is, from your perspective? It's Arabella Figg." He glanced back. "You've spent 20 years worried about the records she might have kept. You had someone visit her in 1999 to check whether she was a problem. You watched and you waited and you tried to be strategic about it. And in the end, she just walked in on a Tuesday morning with a trolley." He knocked on the door for Ferris. "That's the thing about people who have been watching quietly for a very long time. You can't spot them coming because they've never stopped being ordinary." The door opened. Harry walked out. Behind him, Dolores Umbridge sat at her small table in her grey shift and did not make a sound, because she was a woman who had always known exactly when she was losing and had never, in 30 years of calculated behavior, been able to afford the luxury of letting that show. He was back in London by 10. Neville met him at the ministry entrance with coffee and the expression of someone who had decided not to ask how it had gone and was communicating this decision very loudly. "Cho talked to Skeeter," Neville said, falling into step beside him. "And? She's holding." Neville handed him the coffee. 1 week. "She wants the exclusive and she wants access to Arabella directly, not through a DMLE liaison." "That's fair," Harry said. "She also wants to know, Skeeter, not Arabella, whether you'll do a personal statement for the piece." "Not a quote. A statement. In your own words." Harry considered this as they walked toward the lifts. "What does Hermione think?" "That it's strategically valuable for the public to hear from you directly before the inquest and that you should do it but keep it short and factual." He paused. "She also said it was entirely your decision and that she would support whatever you chose." Tell Skeeter yes, Harry said. Short and factual. They reached the secure room. Cho was at the timeline, which had grown overnight. 3 new orange flags had been added, plus a section Abernathy had labeled Malfoy Estate, preliminary in neat letters and had not yet annotated. Proudfoot was at his desk with a stack of legal archive records that came up to his ear, the sort of stack that meant he'd found something. Talk to me, Harry said. Proudfoot pulled the top folder. Malfoy Estate Trust Records, 1998 to 2001. The estate was under a trustee management arrangement while Lucius was incarcerated. This is normal, it's what high-value magical estates do when the primary holder is unable to manage. The trustee was a firm called Caro and Associates, which is, Caro, Harry said. Not those Caros, a different family connection, cousins of the Hogwarts Caros, third removed. But the firm had a number of clients with former Death Eater connections, and their work for the Malfoy estate between 1999 and 2001 included, he turned a page. A series of payments to an entity called the Hogwarts Historical Preservation Trust. Which doesn't exist in any official Hogwarts records, Cho said from the timeline, without looking up. Because it's not a Hogwarts entity, Proudfoot continued. It was established in 1998 and dissolved in 2002, and its registered purpose was the preservation and appropriate management of documents and records relating to the history of Hogwarts School. Its 3 trustees were a former Board of Governors member named Parkinson, Pansy's father, Neville said. A solicitor named Blythe who I'm still running background on, and... He looked up. A man named Alastair Greer. Who is currently a senior archivist in the Hogwarts Library. The room went quiet. He's still there, Harry said. Yes. He was the 1999 visitor, Cho said. I'll stake my career on it. Harry looked at the orange flags on the wall. The fake trust was funded by the Malfoy estate through Caro and Associates. Its purpose was to identify and secure, or suppress, documents relating to Hogwarts history that could be reputationally inconvenient. Arabella Figg was one of several targets. How many others? Hermione asked from the doorway. She'd arrived while Proudfoot was talking, slipping in quietly in the way she sometimes did when she wanted to hear the briefing cold. We don't know yet, Proudfoot said. Find out. She came fully into the room, set down her bag, and looked at the timeline. Greer needs to be interviewed. Today if possible, before word gets back to him that we're looking at the trust records. She looked at Harry. And before you say you'll do it personally, I'm sending Cho. I wasn't going to, Harry started. You were thinking it. He hadn't been thinking it, actually. He'd been thinking Neville, but he accepted this with good grace because Hermione was right that Cho was the better choice for an archival interview, and sometimes being managed by Hermione was just faster than arguing. Cho, he said. On it. She was already gathering her coat. Don't go through official channels at Hogwarts, Harry said. If Greer has any current connection to the board, they'll warn him. I know how to do a surprise interview, she said, and she was out the door. She came back at 2 in the afternoon with Greer in tow. Not in custody, she'd invited him in for a voluntary conversation with the particular tone of someone who was explaining that voluntary was the advisable choice, and Greer, who was a thin, nervous man in his early 50s with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a knock on the door for 20 years, had come without argument. He'd brought his solicitor's contact information and offered it immediately upon arriving, which Hermione took as a confirmation that he'd known this day was coming. Hermione and Proudfoot took the interview. Harry and Neville watched through the adjacent room's monitoring mirror. Greer confirmed, within 15 minutes, that he had visited Arabella Figg in 1999 at the instruction of the Hogwarts Historical Preservation Trust. He confirmed the trust's primary funder was the Malfoy estate via Caro and Associates. He confirmed the trust's purpose was to identify anyone who might have kept records pertaining to Dumbledore's decisions during the war and immediately post-war. Who gave the trust the name Arabella Figg specifically? Hermione asked. Greer looked at his folded hands. I was told the name came from internal order of the Phoenix records. Someone who had access to order documentation identified her as a potential. He stopped. Risk, Hermione said. They called it a potential information liability. Who had access to order records in 1998 and 1999? Greer was quiet for a moment. There was a committee, he said. After the war. A group of order members who were managing what they called the archival legacy. Making sure the order's wartime records were, appropriately preserved. The phrase landed oddly, and Hermione's quill paused on the page for a fraction of a second. Several prominent members. I didn't have direct contact with them. I was a contractor. I was given names and addresses and asked to make inquiries. Give me the committee, Hermione said. He gave her 4 names. Harry watched through the mirror, and when the 4th name was read out, Neville made a sound next to him that was approximately the noise of a man who had been sucker-punched. Elphias Doge, Neville said quietly. He was Dumbledore's oldest friend, Harry said. He wrote the obituary in the Prophet. He defended him in the Deathly Hallows book Skeeter. He was protecting a legacy, Harry said. Not a cover-up. Not for malicious reasons. He genuinely believed Dumbledore was the best wizard of the age and he was protecting that belief. Does that make it better? Harry watched Hermione write Doge's name in her careful handwriting. No, he said. It makes it sadder. By 4 o'clock, 3 things happened in quick succession. Proudfoot confirmed the identity of the second index name, the person who had provided order records to the 1998 committee, and it was someone Harry knew well, someone still living, someone who would need to be told they were going to be called as a witness before the inquest rather than after. Priya completed a second analysis and confirmed, with the kind of precision that would stand up in front of the Wisengamot, that the suppression charms on Privet Drive matched, not resembled, matched, the specific magical signature associated with Dumbledore's recorded works in the Ministry archives. Definitive attribution. And Draco Malfoy walked into the DMLE reception and asked to speak to Harry Potter. Harry heard about this last one from Cho, who delivered it with the expression of someone who had been having an interesting day and had just found out it wasn't finished. He went to reception himself. Draco was standing by the window with his hands in the pockets of a coat that had been expensive once and had been worn enough to become something better than expensive. He was thinner than Harry remembered from the war, sharper somehow, and his face when he turned had none of the performance about it, none of the Malfoy mask that Harry had read so many different versions of across 20 years. He just looked like a man who had decided to do something difficult. You got my note, Harry said. I sent it 3 days ago. I was starting to wonder, Draco said. We've been busy. Yes, I imagine you have. Draco looked at him. I want to make a formal statement. On the record. About the trust, the committee, what I knew, what I sanctioned, what I didn't. He paused. The estate was in trusteeship. I was 20. I didn't sanction the visit to Mrs. Figg specifically. I found out about it 6 months later and he stopped. I didn't stop it. I knew about the trust and I didn't ask enough questions about what it was doing, and I knew why it existed, and I let it continue until 2002 because it was easier then what? Harry said. Draco looked at him directly. Then admitting that the version of events we were all supposed to be comfortable with was a version of events that required someone like Arabella Figg to be silenced. His voice was level. I'm not asking for credit for coming here. I'm telling you I have records, financial records, correspondence, everything Caro and Associates processed for the estate, and I want to give them to you. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Why now, he said. Because she came in on Tuesday morning with 30 years of notes, Draco said, and by Thursday morning every person in this building knows about it, and I have spent the last 8 years trying to be someone who doesn't look away from things. He met Harry's eyes. I'm not very good at it yet. But I'm trying. Harry considered him. Come upstairs, he said. Hermione will take your statement. Draco nodded. They walked to the lifts together, not talking, in the complicated particular silence of two people who had been on opposite sides of something for a long time and were now, without ceremony, on the same side of something else, not friends, not enemies, just two adults choosing to be in the same room with the truth because the alternative was the kind of person neither of them wanted to be anymore. The lift opened. They went up. At 6 o'clock, when the secure room had finally gone quiet for the first time in 3 days, Proudfoot gone home with strict instructions to sleep, Cho updating the timeline alone with methodical calm, Priya's report stacked neatly at the end of the table, Harry sat in the corner with Neville and a paper bag of chips from the canteen and let himself be tired. Not defeated. Just tired. The clean tiredness of someone who has done a hard day's work and knows the work is going forward. Doge, Neville said, without preamble. Yeah. How do you want to handle it? Harry ate a chip. Carefully, he said. He's 80-something and he genuinely loved Dumbledore and he thought he was protecting something good. He paused. He wasn't. What he protected was a lie, and the lie had consequences, and he needs to say so under oath. But carefully. You're going to talk to him yourself. Tomorrow morning. And then? Harry looked at the timeline on the wall. All its colors. Red and blue and green and yellow and orange. The shape of 30 years laid flat and visible. At the end of it, the white parchment of Draco's note, now replaced with a proper evidence flag, orange like the rest of the post-mortem suppression, pointing at something that would take another day to fully map. Then the inquest, he said. You ready for that? Harry ate another chip. I've been ready since Tuesday morning, he said. I just didn't know it yet. Neville laughed, quiet, genuine. Outside the ministry windows, London was going about its evening, 7 million people in their ordinary lives, and in the secure room on the 4th sublevel, Cho Chang added the last orange flag of the day to the timeline and stepped back to look at it, and the wall looked like a map of something that had been invisible for a very long time and had just, finally, become possible to see. Chapter 5. The inquest. The Daily Prophet hit doorsteps at 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after Arabella Figg had pushed a squeaky-wheeled trolley down a ministry corridor, and it hit them like a stone through glass. Rita Skeeter had kept her word. She'd held the story for the full week Harry had asked for, and then she'd spent the second week doing what good journalists did with time and access, she'd gone deeper. The front page was a single photograph, Arabella Figg, standing in her garden on Wisteria Walk, in the green cardigan, looking directly at the camera with those grey eyes that didn't ask for anything and didn't apologize for anything either. No wand. No drama. Just a woman standing in her garden. The headline was 3 words. She wrote it down. The subheading ran beneath it in slightly smaller type, 30 years of documented evidence. One woman. The questions nobody asked about the boy who lived. The article itself was 4 pages, which was 3 more than the Prophet typically gave anything. Skeeter had written it in the first person, which she almost never did, and the effect was startling, her voice stripped of its usual theatrical flourish, operating in a register that was simply here is what I was shown and here is what it means. She named the journals. She named the suppression charms. She described, in precise and careful language, what Arabella had documented in the summer of 1989, the glass of water through the hedge, the 2 large clothes, the birthday in an empty house. She quoted 3 lines from Dumbledore's 1991 letter. She did not editorialize. She didn't need to. On page 3, she ran a short, factual statement from Harry Potter. Arabella Figg spent 30 years as a witness when she should have been supported as a whistleblower. What she documented is true. I know it is true because I lived it. The formal DMLE conduct review and subsequent Wisengamot inquest will establish the institutional record. What I want people to understand before that process begins is this: the woman who walked into the ministry with those journals is the most important person in this story, and she has been invisible for 30 years. That ends now. By 6:15, the ministry flu network was running hot. By 7, Kingsley had issued his statement of ministerial non-interference, which had been pre-prepared and which Hermione had reviewed twice and which was careful and unambiguous and cost him something, and the cost of it was visible in every sentence. By 8, Harry had received 43 owls and had read none of them. He was already in the Wisengamot chamber. The Wisengamot chamber smelled of old wood and older magic, the particular smell of a room that had absorbed centuries of consequential decisions and had not quite let any of them go. The tiered seating ran around 3 sides in dark oak, and in the morning light from the enchanted windows, which showed a sky outside that didn't entirely correspond to the actual London weather, the chamber had the quality of something that had been built to outlast the people who used it. The inquest had been formally convened under emergency proceedings statute, which Hermione had petitioned for and which the Wisengamot clerk had granted on the grounds that the evidence presented contained matters of active public interest requiring expedited consideration. It meant they bypassed the standard 3-month scheduling queue. It also meant there were 47 Wisengamot members present rather than the usual full complement of 50, because 3 members had declared conflicts of interest and recused themselves, which was itself notable given that they'd recused themselves before proceedings began and nobody had asked them to. Harry sat in the witness preparation room off the side of the main chamber and drank ministry coffee that was worse than the canteen coffee and watched Hermione pace. She wasn't anxious. Hermione Granger paced when she was at peak operational focus, when she was running through sequencing in her head with the concentration of a chess player 3 moves ahead of the board. She had her files organized in 4 color-coded folders. She had Proudfoot and Cho positioned in the gallery with the evidence documents. She had Abernathy at the clerk's table with the full cross-reference report. She had Priya ready to present the trace analysis. She had Draco Malfoy's written statement already entered into the record. What she didn't have yet was the thing that was making her pace. "She'll be here," Harry said. "She was supposed to be here at 7:30, Hermione said. "It's 7:58. The session starts at 9. Hermione." He looked at her. "She's been waiting 30 years. She's not going to miss this." As if on cue, the door opened and Arabella Figg came in a different cardigan, dark blue this time, which Harry had come to understand was her best one, carrying her canvas bag and moving with the unhurried certainty that had cleared the DMLE corridor on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago. "The flu at Hogsmeade Station was backed up," she said, without apology. "Something about a student with an engorgement charm and a flobberworm, which I chose not to investigate further." She sat down, put her bag on the table, and looked at both of them. "How are we?" "Ready," Harry said. "Good." She straightened her cardigan. She looked at the door to the main chamber, and for a moment something moved across her face, not fear, nothing like fear, but the full weight of something that had been carried for a very long time and was about to be set down. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to say," she said. "You don't have to prepare with us," Hermione said. "You're a witness, not, I know." Arabella looked at her. "I've been preparing since 1983. I think I've got it." She paused. "I just wanted to say something to both of you before we go in there." She looked at Harry first, then Hermione, with those gray eyes that had watched a street for 30 years. "Whatever happens in that chamber today, whatever the Wisengamot decides, whatever the record says at the end of it, it already matters. Because it's being done. Because we're here." She looked at Harry. "You could have told me not to do this. You could have called me 2 weeks ago and said you didn't want it opened. And you didn't." "No," Harry said. "That mattered to me," she said simply. "That's all." Harry looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had given 30 years to watching over a child she hadn't been asked to love, who had written it down every day not knowing if it would ever be read, who had pushed a trolley through a ministry corridor on a Tuesday morning with the absolute conviction of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. "Arabella," he said. "Whatever happens today, I need you to know that I'm glad you were on Wisteria Walk." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. "I'm glad I was too," she said. "Most days." She stood up. "Right. Shall we go in?" The Wisengamot chamber filled in the way that large institutional spaces filled, gradually, then all at once, with the quality of a tide coming in. Members took their seats in the tiered oak rows. The public gallery, which had been opened for this proceeding under transparency statute, filled quickly, ministry staff, journalists, people who had operated from across Britain when the prophet had hit that morning. Harry spotted, in the third row of the gallery, 3 former order members. He spotted McGonagall, who had not been able to stay away after all, and hadn't tried to pretend otherwise. He spotted Arthur Weasley near the aisle, sitting very still with his hands on his knees, and he'd have to be dealt with carefully, but not today. Today Arthur was here as a private citizen and that was how it would stay. He did not spot Elphia's Doge, which he'd half expected, and the absent said something. He'd visited Doge 2 days ago, in the old man's cluttered house in Somerset where the walls were covered in photographs of Dumbledore across 6 decades. He'd done it alone, without Hermione or Neville, without a recording quill, because some conversations needed to be private before they could be public. Doge had been 86 and fragile and not fragile at all in the places that counted, and he'd opened the door and looked at Harry and said, before Harry could speak, "I know why you've come." They'd sat for 2 hours. Doge had cried once, briefly, and Harry had let it happen without comment, because it had been real grief for a real man who had genuinely loved his friend and had spent 20 years protecting the wrong version of him. And then Doge had dried his eyes and said, in a voice that was old and very tired and utterly clear, "What do you need from me?" Harry had told him. Doge had agreed to provide a written statement to the inquest rather than testifying in person. His health was genuinely not up to the chamber, and the statement had been received and entered into record yesterday afternoon. It named the committee. It named the trust. It described, in the precise and painful language of someone accounting for themselves honestly for the first time, what had been decided and what the why had actually meant. Harry had read it on the way back from Somerset, in the train, and he'd sat with the window dark and the carriage mostly empty, and he'd thought about the fact that people who loved badly were sometimes harder to account for than people who simply didn't love at all, because loving badly left so many good intentions in the rubble. The chief warlock called the chamber to order at 9:03. His name was Harrington, a solid, methodical man in his 60s who had been elected to the position 3 years ago on a reform platform and who looked at the packed chamber with the expression of someone who had understood, when he opened the prophet that morning, that today was going to be one of those days that the office's history would eventually reduce to a single sentence, and who had decided that the sentence was going to read well. "This inquest is convened under emergency proceeding statute," he said, and his voice carried easily in the chamber's acoustics, which had been engineered for exactly this purpose across several centuries. "The subject of inquiry is the conduct of the late Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, specifically his decisions and actions regarding the placement and ongoing treatment of one Harry James Potter during the period 1981 to 1997, and the subsequent conduct of individuals and entities who acted to suppress the documentation of those decisions in the post-war period. The inquiry is investigative rather than criminal in nature, as the primary subject is deceased. However, findings of fact may be referred to appropriate departments for further action regarding living individuals implicated in the post-war suppression activities." He looked at the chamber. "Deputy Head Granger will present the evidence." Hermione stood. And for the next 3 hours, she took the Wisengamot through it. She did it the way she did everything, thoroughly, precisely, without theatrics, because the evidence didn't need theatrics. The journals. The timeline. The suppression charms. The portrait transcript. The Umbridge countersignature. The trust. The committee. The Malfoy estate records. Draco's statement. Doge's statement. Priya's trace analysis, presented in full with visual displays that showed, mapped onto a diagram of number 4 Privet Drive, exactly where and how the containment charms had been placed and what they'd been designed to do. The chamber was very quiet throughout. Not the quiet of an audience that had lost interest, the opposite, the quality of quiet in a room full of people who are listening with their whole bodies because what they're hearing is rearranging something. Harry watched faces in the tiered rows, watched members he recognized from years of Auror proceedings, watched the particular expressions of people who had grown up on chocolate frog cards and were currently sitting with the information that the man on those cards had decided a child's suffering was an acceptable instrument of policy. At 11:30, Hermione concluded her presentation and called the first witness. Arabella Figg walked to the witness chair with her canvas bag over her shoulder, and the chamber was so quiet that her footsteps were audible on the stone floor. She sat down. She folded her hands. "Mrs. Figg," Hermione said. "Please describe, in your own words, what you witnessed at number 4 Privet Drive between the years 1983 and 2001. And Arabella Figg, who had been keeping notes for 30 years, who had watched through a hedge and taken photographs and steamed open letters and moved her journals to a Muggle storage unit in Guildford and kept going anyway, opened her mouth and told the truth. She talked for 2 hours. She didn't use notes. She didn't need them. She had 30 years of meticulous documentation and the specific, photographic memory of someone who had trained themselves to observe, and she spoke with the quiet authority of a person who had been waiting for an audience for a very long time and was not going to waste it. She described the bruising. She described the food restriction. She described the summer of 1993 and the cat flap on the bedroom door and what she'd managed to observe about the food passed through it. She described the birthday every year, the way it passed without ceremony, the way she'd pushed cards and small amounts of Muggle money through the hedge because it was the only thing she could do that didn't require the sort of official channels that had been designed, she now understood, to go nowhere. She described the water through the hedge in 1989. She described the moment she'd given it and the way the 7-year-old had drunk it in one go and said thank you in the voice of a child who had learned to be grateful for small things. In the third row of the public gallery, Arthur Weasley put his face in his hands. Arabella described the letters she'd sent that had been ignored. She described Dumbledore's 1991 reply and read it aloud, the full text, not just the excerpts, and the phrase appropriately challenging moved through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward. She described the 1995 Dementor attack and the formal complaint she'd filed and what had happened to it. She described the 1999 visit from Greer, and what she'd done with the journals afterward, and why. "Mrs. Figg," said Counselor Adeyemi from the third tier, a sharp, senior member who had been taking notes throughout, in 30 years of observation, did anyone from the magical world ever come to Privet Drive specifically to check on Harry Potter's well-being? Arabella considered this. "Several Order members visited over the years," she said. "Members of the informal guard that was set up in his 5th year came near the property but did not typically interact with him. Various individuals came to collect him for events, the Quidditch World Cup, for example." She paused. "No one came, in 30 years, for the purpose of checking whether he was being treated adequately." Adeyemi wrote something. "No one sent a welfare check," Arabella said. "No one from Hogwarts conducted a home visit before his first term. No one from the ministry assessed the placement. No one from the Order was formally tasked with his welfare as opposed to his survival." She looked at the chamber. "He wasn't checked on. He was maintained." The word fell into the room and stayed there. Harry was called at 2 in the afternoon. He walked to the witness chair from the side door without looking at the gallery, not because he was avoiding it but because it wasn't relevant, and because the way to do this was the way he'd approached every difficult thing in the past 15 years, which was directly and without performance. He sat. "Mr. Potter," Hermione said, in her formal voice, the one she reserved for proceedings. "You are Harry James Potter, Senior Auror, Order of Merlin 2nd Class." "I am." "You were the subject of the surveillance documented in the 32 journals entered into evidence." "I was." "And you have reviewed all 32 journals?" "Yes." "Can you confirm, to the best of your knowledge, that the observations recorded in those journals accurately reflect your experience at number 4 Privet Drive?" Harry looked at the chamber. 47 members. The public gallery. The journalists in the designated press section, all of them with their quills out. Skeeter at the end of the row, for whom he felt, in this moment, something that was not quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. Yes, he said. They're accurate. Hermione nodded. In your experience, were you at any point during your childhood made aware that you were being observed on behalf of the magical world? No. Were you aware that your accidental magic was being suppressed by charms placed on the property? No. I assumed the trace monitoring system was simply less active near the Dursleys' house. I thought it was part of the blood protection. He paused. I found out what it actually was 4 days ago. When you read the trace analysis report. When I read the trace analysis report. Hermione moved to the next section. I want to ask you about the summer of 1995, specifically the period between the end of the school year and the Dementor attack on July the 31st. Can you describe your circumstances that summer? He described them. He did it factually and without embellishment, the way you described the case file, the isolation, the lack of information about the war, the specific quality of that summer which had been different from previous summers because there was a dead body in it, a dead boy in a graveyard, a returned Dark Lord, and nobody sending word about any of it because Dumbledore had decided isolation was safer. Several Wizengamot members were very still. And after the Dementor attack? Hermione said. I was given a disciplinary hearing. The Ministry attempted to expel me from Hogwarts for performing underage magic in front of a Muggle. The charge was dropped. He looked at the chamber. I did not, at the time, know that someone within the Ministry had ordered the attack. I did not know that a formal complaint had been filed on my behalf and suppressed. He paused. I found that out last week. Harrington, the chief warlock, leaned forward. Mr. Potter, he said, and his voice was measured, how would you characterize the nature of the decisions made by Albus Dumbledore regarding your placement and treatment? Harry looked at him. He'd thought about this question. He'd known it was coming, or something like it, and he'd thought about it on the train back from Somerset and in the secure room in the small hours of the morning and in Arabella's kitchen with Builder's tea and on the boat to Azkaban, turning it over, making sure the answer he gave was the one he actually meant. Deliberate, he said. Calculated. Not malicious. I want to be careful with that word, because malice implies a desire to cause suffering for its own sake, and I don't believe that was his motivation. He held Harrington's gaze. What I believe is that he identified a necessary outcome and worked backward from it, and that the suffering was a side effect he considered acceptable because it produced the result he needed. I believe he chose a particular kind of environment for me because he needed me to be a particular kind of person, humble, not too attached to life, accustomed to sacrifice. He paused. And I believe that is worse than malice. Malice is at least honest about what it is. What Dumbledore did was dress a calculation in the language of love, and then ensure there was no official record that would require him to defend the calculation. The chamber was silent. He also, Harry said, was a great man who genuinely cared about the outcome and genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. Those two things are both true. I'm not here to destroy his legacy. I'm here to make sure the legacy is accurate. Counselor Adeyemi leaned forward. Mr. Potter, given everything you now know, given the documented evidence of deliberate management of your circumstances, including the suppression of potential investigations, how would you describe your childhood? Harry sat with that for a moment. I would describe it, he said carefully, as something that happened to a child who deserved better, and that the fact it happened the way it did was not inevitable. It was chosen. He looked at the Wizengamot. There were alternatives. The portrait confirmed it. Dumbledore considered alternatives. He chose this one because it served the plan. And the plan worked. He was quiet for a moment. Which is the part one still don't entirely know what to do with. The plan worked. I lived. Voldemort was defeated. All of that is true. And also, it shouldn't have happened this way. And also, a woman in a green cardigan sat in a house on a Surrey street and wrote it down every day for 30 years and refused to let it disappear. He paused. I think what I want the record to reflect is that both things can be true, and that acknowledging both things is more honest than choosing one. The afternoon session ran long. Priya presented the trace analysis to a chamber that had by this point absorbed enough information that technical detail was welcomed rather than resisted. The members had become an audience that wanted to understand, not just to receive. She was clear and precise and answered follow-up questions with the patient authority of someone who knew her subject absolutely. Greer testified briefly and with obvious relief, the relief of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a long time and was grateful to be relieved of it. His testimony was corroborative rather than revelatory at this stage, but it placed the post-mortem suppression on the formal record with a living witness attached to it. Draco Malfoy's written statement was read into the record by the clerk, and the chamber absorbed the Malfoy name with the particular attention of people who had 20 years of complicated feelings about that name and were now being asked to apply it in a new context. Harry watched faces adjust. It was, he thought, one of the more interesting things about being in a room when history was being revised in real time. You could see people's internal reorganization happening on their faces. At 4:30, Harrington suspended proceedings until the following morning to allow the chamber to deliberate. Harry and Hermione and Neville and Arabella sat in the witness preparation room while the chamber emptied around them, and nobody said anything for a moment, because sometimes the right response to a day like this was just to let it breathe. Arabella said eventually. God, yes, Neville said. Hermione was already at the door to flag down a ministry aide, because even on the most important days of your professional life the mechanism of tea still had to be operated by a human being. Harry looked at Arabella. How are you? Tired, she said. Very tired. And, she paused, searching for the word. Lighter. I feel lighter. She looked at him. Is that strange? No, he said. That's what happens when you put something down that you've been carrying for 30 years. She looked at him with those gray eyes. How are you? She asked, and it was the genuine version of the question, the version that wasn't making conversation. He thought about it honestly. I'm good, he said. And then, because it was true and because she'd earned the truth, I'm really, genuinely good. It wasn't what I expected. What did you expect? I thought it would feel like, he considered. Like reopening something. But it doesn't. It feels like, closing it properly. Closing something that was never closed properly the first time. He looked at the chamber door. Whatever they decide tomorrow, the record exists. It's in the transcript. It's in the journals. It's in the prophet. It can't be made to not have happened. Arabella nodded slowly. The tea arrived. They drank it. Outside in the Wisengamot antechamber, at 5:10, Harry was stopped by Counselor Adeyemi, who was pulling on her cloak with the air of someone who had something to say and had decided to say it. Off the record, she said. Off the record, Harry agreed. Your statement this afternoon, the part about both things being true simultaneously. She looked at him. I've been on this chamber for 14 years. I've sat through war crimes proceedings, post-war sentencing, 3 complete overhauls of the Juvenile Justice Code. I've never heard anyone in a witness chair describe a situation involving their own suffering with that much. She paused. Clarity. It took a while to get there, Harry said. I imagine. She buttoned her cloak. The findings tomorrow will be formal and on the record. I can't tell you what they'll say. She met his eyes. I can tell you that 9 members this morning privately told the Chief Warlock they wanted to review the 3 post-war cases where Dumbledore's name appeared as corroborating evidence. She paused. That's going to take time and it's going to be complicated. I know, Harry said. And some people are going to be angry, she said. Some people are going to take this as an attack on the war itself, on the victory, on. Some people always take accountability as an attack, Harry said. That's not a reason to avoid it. Adeyemi looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, brief, real. No, she said. It isn't. She moved toward the exit. Good evening, Mr. Potter. Good evening, Counselor. He watched her go. The antechamber was nearly empty now, the sounds of the departing day settling into the ministry's particular evening quiet. Neville was waiting by the lifts. Hermione had gone back to the secure room to organize for tomorrow. Arabella had been escorted to a ministry guest room. They'd arranged for her to stay overnight so she didn't have to navigate the flu system exhausted, and she'd accepted this with the practical grace of a woman who had learned to accept good things when they were offered. Neville handed Harry his coat. "Rita Skeeter is outside," Neville said. "I know. You're going to talk to her?" "She held the story," Harry said, putting on his coat. That was an act of professional self-restraint that is not native to Rita Skeeter, and it served the inquest. "I'm going to say thank you." He moved toward the door. "Also, she's going to write tomorrow's article anyway, and it's better if I've recently looked her in the eye." "Strategic gratitude," Neville said. "It's both," Harry said. "It's not one or the other. It doesn't have to be." Neville fell into step beside him. "You said that a lot today. Both things being true. Because it keeps being true. Dumbledore loved you and it was still wrong. Yes. Doge was trying to protect something good and it was still harmful. Yes. And Neville paused. "You're going to be all right with all of it. With all the bothness." Harry looked at him. Outside, through the ministry's glass doors, he could see the early evening of a London October, the orange glow of streetlights coming on, people moving on the pavement, the ordinary texture of a city that did not know and did not need to know what had happened in a chamber full of old wood and older magic. "I already am," he said. He pushed open the door. Skeeter was waiting on the steps in a fur-trimmed coat, her quick quotes quill conspicuously absent, which was its own signal about the register of the conversation she was prepared to have. She looked at Harry when he came out with the calculating but genuine expression of someone who had been in the journalism business long enough to know the difference between a story and a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," Harry said. "Good day. Necessary day." He stopped on the step above her, which put them roughly at eye level. "The article this morning. The photograph of Arabella." He looked at her directly. "That was good work." Something crossed Skeeter's face that was not what people who thought they knew her would expect. "She sat for the photograph for 45 minutes, she said. She kept asking me if it was right, if the light was right. I told her it wasn't about the light, it was about her face." She paused. "She has a very honest face." "She does," Harry said. "Tomorrow's article," Skeeter said. "I want to lead with your testimony. The both things being true part. That's in the official transcript. I know it's in the transcript. I want to lead with it because it's the part that changes the conversation from, Dumbledore was a monster, to something more honest, and more honest is always a better story." She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to rehabilitate him. I'm not trying to condemn him either. I want to write what actually happened, and what actually happened is complicated." "Then write the complicated version," Harry said. "That's what I'm asking permission for." "You don't need my permission." "No," she said. "But I wanted to look you in the face when I said I was going to do it." She paused. "Professionally, I mean." Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You should also write about what Arabella said about the water through the hedge. That's the part that," he stopped. "That's the part that needs to be in the record." Skeeter wrote nothing down. She just nodded. "Good evening, Mr. Potter." "Good evening, Miss Skeeter." He went down the steps into the London evening with Neville beside him, and behind him the ministry rose in its government solidity against the dimming sky, and inside it, in the secure room on the 4th sublevel, 32 journals sat in their careful order and waited for tomorrow. Chapter 6, The Reckoning. The Wisengamot delivered its findings on a Tuesday morning. 3 weeks, almost to the hour, from the moment Arabella Figg had pushed a squeaky-wheeled trolley down a ministry corridor and changed the shape of things. Harry noticed the symmetry and didn't mention it to anyone, because the kind of person who mentioned symmetries at serious moments was the kind of person who was performing significance rather than experiencing it, and he'd spent enough of his life as a symbol without adding to the collection voluntarily. The chamber was fuller than it had been during testimony. The public gallery had a queue outside it that started forming before 6 a.m. Hermione had been told by the gallery clerk at 7:15, when she arrived with her files, that people had been operating in from Edinburgh, from Cardiff, from a village in the Orkneys whose entire population apparently felt strongly enough about this to make the journey. The press section was at capacity. Skeeter was in the front row with a new quill and the expression of someone who had slept well because she had already written 3 drafts of the story and knew which version she was going to publish. Kingsley was in the minister's observing box, which was a raised section at the north end of the chamber separated from the main floor by a low railing and occupied only during proceedings of significant public interest. He had brought 2 aides and no visible expression, which Harry recognized as the face Kingsley wore when he had already decided what he was going to do and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. McGonagall was in the public gallery again, this time in the front row. She had not tried to claim a professional seat. She was there as a person, which felt right. Arthur Weasley was there again too, same aisle seat, same stillness. He'd sent Harry a letter 3 days ago, not defending himself, not explaining himself, just a single page in Arthur's distinctive slightly slanted handwriting that said, "I should have asked more questions. I knew something wasn't right and I believed what I was told because it was easier. I'm sorry, Harry. Truly. Arthur." Harry had written back 2 lines, "I know. Come to dinner on Sunday. H." It wasn't resolution. It was the beginning of one, which was all it needed to be right now. Neville was next to Harry in the witness area, which they had retained access to for the findings delivery, and he had brought coffee from outside the ministry, a Muggle coffee shop 2 streets down that Harry had introduced him to 3 years ago and that Neville now visited with the loyalty of a convert. He handed Harry a cup without a word. Harry took it. Arabella sat between them in her dark blue cardigan, her canvas bag on her lap, her hands folded on top of it, watching the chamber fill with the patient attention she brought to everything. Chief Warlock Harrington called the chamber to order at 9:02. He was composed and precise in the way of someone who understood that the document he was about to read had been written very carefully and needed to be delivered in kind. The chamber settled into the particular quiet of 47 people choosing to listen. He read the findings. He read them in full, without summary or abbreviation, because the Wisengamot's findings were a legal document and legal documents resisted paraphrase, and this one, specifically, had been constructed to be resistant to future selective quotation. He read each section in order, the factual summary of evidence presented, the witness testimony, the supporting documentation, the expert analysis. And then he reached the findings of fact. The Wisengamot, sitting in formal inquest, finds as follows, Harrington said, and the chamber was absolutely still. First, that Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, late headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, did knowingly and deliberately place the minor Harry James Potter in a residential environment at No. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey, with full knowledge that the environment posed risks to the child's welfare that exceeded acceptable standards under Wizarding Child Protection Statute. He turned the page. Second, that Dumbledore did knowingly suppress the potential for official welfare investigation through the deliberate placement of magical suppression charms designed to prevent the detection of accidental magic generated by the minor, thereby preventing the triggering of standard ministry monitoring protocols that would have required an investigative response. He turned another page. Third, that Dumbledore received documented communication from a civilian observer, Arabella Figg of Wisteria Walk, Little Whinging, on multiple occasions raising specific welfare concerns, and that he failed to act on those concerns and failed to ensure they were escalated through appropriate channels. In the press section, quills were moving. In the public gallery, nobody was moving at all. Fourth, that Dolores Jane Umbridge, former senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, did deliberately abuse her administrative authority to suppress a formal welfare complaint filed in 1995 regarding an attack on the minor Harry James Potter, thereby preventing that complaint from being received and acted upon by appropriate officials. The Wisingamot refers this finding to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for consideration of additional charges to be applied to the existing sentence of the named individual. At this, something moved through the chamber, not applause, not sound, just a collective physical shift, the movement of 47 people adjusting in their seats simultaneously. Fifth, that individuals acting in the post-war period to suppress documentation of the above decisions, specifically through the activities of the Hogwarts Historical Preservation Trust and its associated principles, did obstruct the lawful documentation of matters of public interest and welfare significance. The Wisingamot refers the relevant evidence to the DMLE for assessment of potential obstruction charges. Harrington turned to the final section. The Wisingamot further finds, in formal and binding record, the following statement of the Chamber's position, that the decisions made regarding the childhood placement and welfare of Harry James Potter represent a failure of institutional duty that cannot be adequately addressed through posthumous findings alone. The Chamber therefore orders the following remedial actions. Harry was very still. First, the formal establishment of a Childhood Welfare Review Board within the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, tasked with reviewing historical and ongoing cases of child placement and welfare monitoring to ensure that no child in the care of the wizarding community is subject to conditions equivalent to or worse than those documented in this inquest. Second, the formal revision of Hogwarts admissions and pastoral care protocols to include mandatory home welfare assessment for first-year students prior to enrollment. Third, the commissioning of a permanent record, physical and magical, of this inquest's findings, to be maintained in both the Ministry archives and the Hogwarts Library, to serve as institutional memory of what occurs when child welfare is subordinated to strategic calculation. He looked up. And fourth, he said, and his voice had something in it now, something that wasn't quite outside the register of professional formality but was pressing against its edges, the Wisingamot formally recognizes the contribution of Arabella Figg, civilian observer and Order of the Phoenix Associate, whose 30 years of diligent, courageous, and independent documentation made this inquest possible, and without whose persistence the record would not exist. In the witness area, next to Harry, Arabella Figg sat very still. The Chamber finds that Mrs. Figg's conduct represents the highest expression of civic responsibility and moral courage available to a private individual operating without institutional support, and orders that her contribution be formally acknowledged in the public record of these proceedings. Harrington set the document down. The findings of this inquest are entered into the permanent record of the Wisingamot. This chamber is closed. He struck his gavel once. The chamber erupted. It wasn't chaos, it was sound, full and complex, the sound of a room full of people responding to something that had moved through them, people talking to each other, people standing, the press section producing the specific urgent energy of journalists composing leads in their heads before they'd even stood up. Skeeter was already at the door, Quill moving, not running but walking very fast, which for Rita Skeeter was effectively the same thing. In the witness area, nobody moved for a moment. Arabella was looking at her hands. Harry watched her. He didn't say anything, because there was a category of moment that words moved around rather than through, and this was one of them. He just stayed where he was, close enough that she knew he was there, and let her have it. After a moment she looked up, and her eyes were bright in the way that had nothing to do with tears about to fall and everything to do with tears that had already happened, a long time ago, and had been replaced with something steadier. "Right," she said. "Right," Harry agreed. Neville, on her other side, put his hand briefly over hers on the canvas bag, which was the most Neville thing he could have done and precisely right. Hermione appeared from the side door. She'd been in the chamber floor for the reading, and she came through now with her files and the expression of a woman who had won a case she believed in and was not going to be theatrical about it but was also not going to pretend she wasn't pleased. She sat down across from them. "The DMLE referral on Umbridge," she said. "Proudfoot is already on it. We can have new charges formulated within a week." "Good," Harry said. "The Childhood Welfare Review Board, Kingsley will want to discuss structure. He'll probably ask if you want to be involved." "Tell him I'll advise but not chair," Harry said. "I'm an Auror, not a committee person." Hermione's mouth twitched. I'll tell him you're flattered and committed to a supporting role. Same thing. She looked at Arabella. The formal recognition in the public record, it'll be published in the official gazette tomorrow. And the minister's office will contact you about the physical commemorative aspect, the one that goes in the ministry archives. Arabella nodded. She was still looking at her hands, and then she looked up at Hermione and said something that surprised all of them, not because it was unexpected but because it arrived at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right voice. There's something I'd like to ask, she said. For myself. Not for the record. Everyone looked at her. I've been thinking about what I'd want, if this went well, she said. Not a recognition in a gazette, not a plaque in a ministry corridor, though those things they're kind, and I appreciate them. She straightened her cardigan. What I'd like is something practical. Something that does something. Tell us, Harry said. St. Mungo's has a children's ward, she said. The Janus Thicky ward has a section for magical children who require long-term care, children who are away from their families for extended periods. They have a family room on that ward that doesn't currently have a name. She looked at Harry directly. I'd like to fund a proper family room. Comfortable. With good chairs, and decent tea, and the kind of room where someone could sit for a long time if they needed to. Not a waiting room. A staying room. She paused. And I'd like it to have a name. Whose name? Harry asked. She looked at him. Lily Potter's, she said simply. She died giving him everything she had. She didn't get to do any of the watching. She didn't get any of the years. She looked at her hands again. It would mean something to me for her name to be on a room where children are safe and looked after. I think she'd have liked that. The witness area was very quiet. Harry sat with it. He sat with the full weight of it, the name of his mother on a room in a children's ward, a room where children who needed time and care and steadiness could be with their families, or where people who loved them could wait without it feeling like waiting. He sat with the fact that it was Arabella's idea, Arabella who had watched a child who had no one and had thought, what would his mother have wanted? He breathed. I'll fund it, he said. Jointly. You and me. Arabella looked at him. You spent 30 years, he said. You spent your own money on storage units and your own time and your own energy and you did it alone. You're not doing this part alone. He held her gaze. The Lily Potter family room at St. Mungo's. Funded by Arabella Figg and Harry Potter. Is that all right? She pressed her lips together. That's all right, she said. The ministry was different in the afternoon. Not dramatically, it was still the same building with the same marble floors and the same too many people moving through it with the slightly harried efficiency of an institution that never quite caught up with its own workload. But there was something in the quality of the atmosphere, the particular frequency of conversation, the way people moved in the corridors, something that had shifted, that said, something happened today that is going to take a while to fully land. Harry walked through it on his way back from the secure room, where he'd spent an hour with Hermione going through the next steps, the Umbridge charges, the welfare board structure, the Hogwarts protocol revision, the archival record. It was work. Normal, methodical, important work. The kind that followed big days and was often more significant than the big days themselves because it was where the decisions became real instead of just documented. He stopped at his office, sat at his desk, and opened the Post. There were 87 owls. He'd been expecting more. He sorted through them quickly, the way you did when you'd been the subject of public interest for 2 decades and had long since developed a triage system, the ones that needed a response today, the ones that could wait, the ones that were simply people's feelings moving through the post because people needed somewhere to put their feelings and he was a convenient address. One envelope stopped him. It was plain, no return address, but the handwriting was familiar in the way of handwriting you'd seen on a label in a school corridor, on a grade at the bottom of an essay, on a birthday card left on a dorm table once when you were 15 and someone was trying. It was Neville's handwriting, which didn't make sense because Neville was in the next corridor and had presumably not sent him a letter from next door. He opened it. It wasn't from Neville. It was from Augusta Longbottom, who was 83 and sharp as a tack and wrote letters to express things she would never say out loud. It was 3 paragraphs in an elderly, powerful hand. Mr. Potter, I watched today's proceedings from my sitting room via the wireless, and I want you to know that what you said about both things being true simultaneously is the most sensible thing I have heard said in a public forum in 30 years of paying close attention to public forums. My son Frank believed Albus Dumbledore was the greatest wizard of the age and trusted him absolutely. My son Frank was right and wrong in equal measure, and I have spent 25 years finding a way to hold both of those things at the same time. It has not been easy. You articulated it better than I have managed. I also want to tell you that Neville is exceptional, and that I believe his exceptionality owes nothing to Albus Dumbledore and everything to himself. I tell him this regularly. He does not quite believe me. Perhaps hearing it from you would help. Yours sincerely, Augusta Longbottom. Harry read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his robe, close to the other things he carried that were too real to leave on a desk. He went next door and stuck his head around Neville's office door. Your grandmother wrote me a letter. Neville looked up from his desk where he was also working through post. She didn't. She did. What did she say? She said you're exceptional. Neville went red in the particular way he'd been going red since he was 11. She always, it's a bit much, she's right, Harry said. He said it simply, the way Augusta had said it, without drama. You've been in every room during all of this. Every difficult moment. You've been there. He looked at his friend. I needed that. I needed you there. Neville looked at him. Don't make it weird, he said. I'm not making it weird. You've got your serious face on. I always have my serious face on, it's my default face. Harry leaned against the doorframe. Write your grandmother back. She clearly wants correspondence. She always wants correspondence. She writes 17 letters a week, then write back 17 letters a week. He left Neville looking fond and embarrassed in equal measure, which was a very good look on him, and went back down the corridor toward the lifts. He went to Wisteria Walk one more time. Not on ministry business. Just, there. It was late afternoon, the October light coming in low and gold through the plane trees on the street, the kind of light that made even Surrey look like it might have a soul. He walked from the apparition point at the end of the road because there was no particular reason to rush, and he walked past number 4 on the way. He stopped. He looked at it. The house was the same house. Same door, same windows, same garden that had once been maintained with the particular obsessive tidiness of people who cared more about what their neighbors thought than about what was happening inside. The Dursleys were long gone. They'd moved to Bournemouth in 2003, which Harry knew because the ministry had tracked them for the first 2 years after the war, mostly out of habit and because nobody had officially told them to stop. He had not been in contact with them. He did not intend to be. He stood in front of the house and he did the thing he'd been doing all day, which was holding 2 things at once without dropping either of them. He'd lived here. It had been hard in ways that were documented and in ways that weren't, the small daily indignities that didn't make it into even Arabella's careful notes because they were too granular, too ambient, the texture of a childhood rather than its events. He'd also survived here. He'd learned things here, how to be quiet, how to read people, how to find small pleasures in narrow spaces, how to carry on when carrying on was the only option available. He didn't forgive it. He didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't the goal, had never been the goal, because forgiveness as performed by the wronged party for the benefit of the wronging party was a particular kind of emotional labor that he'd declined a long time ago. What he had instead was something cleaner, an understanding of what had happened and why and what it had made him and what it had cost him, all of it held in the same hands at the same time, none of it dropped. He stood there for a minute. Then he turned and walked to number 7. Arabella opened the door before he knocked. I heard your footsteps, she said. I've been listening to this street for 30 years, I know every footstep pattern. Fair enough, he said. She opened the door wider. He went in. The house was the same warm, slightly cluttered house it had always been, the cat photographs on the wall, the overfull bookshelves, the sitting room with the 2 armchairs positioned to look at both the television and the window with equal efficiency, which had always told Harry everything he needed to know about how she'd spent her evenings. The kettle was already on. He sat in one of the armchairs. She sat in the other. Today, she said. Today, he agreed. She poured the tea. The room was warm and smelled faintly of the lavender she kept in a bowl on the mantelpiece and had kept there for 30 years. Outside the window, the street was doing its Tuesday evening things, cars pulling into drives, lights coming on in windows, someone's dog barking twice and stopping. I want to ask you something, Harry said. And I want you to answer it honestly even if you think it's not what I want to hear. She looked at him. All right. Do you regret it? He said. Any of it? Coming here. Staying. Keeping the notes. All of it. Do you ever wish you'd just, he stopped. Lived a different life? She held her tea in both hands and thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. I regret that it was necessary, she said. I regret that the circumstances were what they were. I regret that I wasn't able to do more, that my position, my nature as a squib, the constraints of the arrangement, meant I was a witness instead of an actor for most of it. She looked at him. But do I regret being here? Do I regret writing it down? She shook her head. No. Not for a single day. Harry looked at his tea. I used to think, he said slowly, that the people who watched and did nothing were all the same. That passivity was passivity. And then I got older and I understood that there's a difference between passivity and helplessness. Between choosing not to see and being unable to do anything except keep watching and writing it down because that's the only tool you have. He looked up at her. You used the only tool you had. For 30 years. Without anyone asking you to continue and without any assurance that it would ever matter. It mattered, she said. It mattered enormously. She looked at him with those gray eyes, and he thought about what Skeeter had said, that she had a very honest face, and he thought about 30 years of an honest face turned toward a street in Surrey, watching, recording, refusing to look away. The room, she said. At St. Mungo's. Lily's room. She paused. I'd like to be there when they put her name on it. You'll be there, Harry said. We'll both be there. She nodded. The street outside was settling into evening. The plane trees were losing their leaves in the October wind, occasional gold shapes drifting past the window. Somewhere on the road, a child was calling to another child, that specific carrying quality of children's voices in the dusk, the pitch of someone who wants to be heard across a distance. Harry turned his cup in his hands. Can I tell you something? He said. Of course. When I was reading your journals, all of them, the first night, there was a moment around Journal 14 where I had to stop. He looked at the window. July 31st, 1994. My birthday. You wrote about watching me sit in the garden after the Dursleys left. You wrote about the way I looked when I noticed the date. He paused. You wrote that I looked resigned. She was very still. You were right, he said. That's exactly what it was. And I've been thinking about that word for 2 weeks. Resigned. Because I didn't know anyone had seen it. I thought that was mine alone, that particular moment. And then I read your note about it and I thought, he stopped. He tried again. I thought, it mattered that you saw it. Even though I didn't know you saw it at the time. Even though you couldn't fix it. It mattered that someone looked at me that day and noticed the truth of it and wrote it down. He looked at her. Does that make sense? Arabella set down her tea. She looked at him for a long moment, and her face did something that 30 years of careful composure made very rare. it opened, fully and without reservation, the face of someone who had been waiting to hear a particular thing and had finally heard it. "Yes," she said. "That makes sense." She reached across and put her hand over his briefly, the gesture of someone who had watched a child grow up and had never been in a position to offer more comfort than a glass of water through a hedge, and who was now, decades too late but not too late entirely, offering something warmer. He let her. It was dark by the time Harry left Wisteria Walk. He walked back down the street the way he'd come, hands in pockets, and the plane trees were black shapes against a sky that had cleared to cold stars, and the street was quiet, and he walked past number 4 one more time without stopping. There were things still to do. The Umbridge charges would take another week to formalize. The welfare board structure needed building from scratch. The Hogwarts protocol revision was going to require extended negotiation with a faculty that was, understandably, going to have complicated feelings about being told its pastoral procedures were inadequate. The archive record needed to be written, the full one, the binding permanent one, and Hermione had already told him she was going to draft it herself because she trusted no one else to get the language right on the first pass. Doge had written to him yesterday, a brief note saying he'd read the inquest findings and that he was glad, not easy, he'd written, but glad, which was a distinction that only someone in his particular position could fully mean. Draco had sent a message through the DMLE simply saying the financial records were fully transferred and that he was available for any follow-up questions. He hadn't asked for anything in return. Harry had written back one line, "Thank you for coming in." HP. Draco had not replied, which felt right. Some acknowledgements didn't need acknowledgement. The Lily Potter family room at St. Mungo's would be formally commissioned in December. Arabella had already been in touch with the ward administrator, because she was Arabella Figg and she did not wait for things to be arranged for her when she could arrange them herself. She described the chairs she wanted, comfortable, not institutional, the kind you could sit in for hours without your back complaining. She described the tea station. She'd mentioned, with the particular precision of someone who knew exactly what a child needed from a room, that there should be books, not medical books, not waiting room magazines, but proper books, the kind that took you somewhere else for a while. Harry had agreed to all of it without modification because she was right about every detail. He reached the end of Wisteria Walk and stood at the apparition point under a plane tree that had been losing leaves all evening, and he looked back at the street one last time. Number 7 was lit up, warm, the window glowing with the particular amber light of a house that was lived in properly. He could see the silhouette of Arabella moving in the sitting room, settling into her armchair, the one angled toward the window, the one she'd sat in for 30 years watching a street. He looked at number 4, which was dark and ordinary and completely itself, a house that had no idea what had been documented about it, that would never know its address had been read aloud in a Wisengamot chamber on a Tuesday morning in October. And then he looked up at the stars, which were very clear tonight, which was rare for London and rarer for Surrey, and he stood there for a moment with everything, all of it, the whole weight of the last 3 weeks and the 30 years before them, held in both hands without dropping any of it. He thought about his mother's name on a wall in a children's ward. He thought about 32 journals in neat order in a government evidence room. He thought about a painted voice saying appropriately challenging and a transcript that would sit in the ministry archives for as long as the ministry existed. He thought about Neville beside him in every room, and Hermione's careful handwriting going slightly uneven, and Cho's orange flags on a timeline wall, and Kingsley's face when he'd read the petition, and McGonagall sitting in the public gallery not as a headmistress but as a person. He thought about a glass of water through a hedge. He thought about what it meant to be seen, not celebrated, not watched strategically, not observed from a distance for purposes of planning, but simply seen, by someone who looked because they cared, and wrote it down because they believed it mattered, and kept going because giving up would have meant letting the thing that was true become the thing that was forgotten. He apparat home. The flat was quiet and warm. He hung up his coat. He made toast because it was nearly 9 and he hadn't eaten since the morning, and while it was toasting he stood at the kitchen window and looked at the London night, and he thought about nothing in particular and everything at once, and when the toast was done he ate it standing up at the counter, which was a habit he'd had since he was 11 and had always meant that he could eat without anyone commenting on it, And which he'd never quite gotten around to changing, and which he'd decided a long time ago he didn't need to change, because it was his. He went to bed. He slept well. The article Skeeter published the next morning led with the line Harrington had spoken in the chamber, the formal recognition of Arabella Figg, and then moved immediately to Harry's testimony, the both things being true section, the part about the plan requiring him to be a particular kind of person. It was careful and clear and utterly without sensationalism, which was the version of Skeeter that most people didn't know existed but which Harry had suspected for years was the real one, the one underneath the performance. The editorial note at the bottom of the piece, after the final paragraph, was 3 sentences. Rita Skeeter was granted exclusive access to the DMLE investigation on the condition that this article not be published until the formal inquest. She would like to state, for the record, that she accepted those conditions not because she was asked to but because the story deserved to be told correctly rather than quickly. She believes Arabella Figg is the most important person in this piece and she intends to say so loudly. Arabella read it at her kitchen table at number 7 Wisteria Walk with her builder's tea and her reading glasses and a cat named Nelson who had replaced the previous Nelson, who had replaced the one before that, in the long succession of Nelsons that had been her company through 30 years of watching. She read it twice. She folded the paper. She looked out her window at the street. Then she opened the new journal, the 33rd, which she'd bought last week from the Muggle stationers on the High Street, and she dated the first page in her small, precise hand. November 3rd. She uncapped her pen. She thought for a moment about what to write, about what the opening entry of a new volume should say, after 32 volumes of a child's survival, after an inquest and a finding and a woman's name going on a wall in a children's ward and a signed document in the ministry archives and the strange, clean feeling of something having been finished properly. She wrote, "It is done. The record is correct. Harry Potter is a man who stands upright and is not afraid of anything, and today his mother's name is going on a wall where children will be safe, and that is the truth. I was a witness for 30 years and I am glad I was. The next thing is whatever comes after." She capped her pen. She looked out the window. The street was doing its ordinary morning things, milk deliveries, cars starting up, someone's curtain moving, the ordinary texture of a world that kept going because that was what worlds did. And in that world, somewhere, in a government building and a school on a Scottish hillside and a hospital ward and a flat in London and 83 owls that had been delivered to various addresses overnight, the truth was on record, witnessed and permanent and impossible to erase, the way truth was when someone had been paying attention. The way truth always was, when someone wrote it down.